were Darians and 5 were school officials, provosts and dorm masters. They'd all been killed with conventional means, if throat-cutting could be considered conventional. None had been killed with conjury, so they hadn't been done by the Witch Queen's son. That fit with what Turant had said, that the boy had been training as a healer and so would be an easy mark. According to the academy, 2 students had gone missing, Lila Barrowhill, a cadet in Wien House, and Ash Hansen, a northern student who was a proficient in mistwork. It appeared that a great deal of killing had happened in Hansen's room. It was awash in blood. But the 2 bodies in there were both Darian brothers. Had the Darians and provosts killed each other? Had Lila intervened? Why would she? From what Turant had said, she and Sulhan weren't particularly close at school. Nor was she the hero type. Anyway, Destin found it hard to believe that a woman could be responsible for so much bloodshed. The king had ordered him to keep Lila away from the killing field as a precaution. Montaigne had no intention of risking one of his most promising operatives, in case a sudden attack of citizenship prompted her to intervene. The irony was that Destin was the one who had recruited Lila. He'd been her handler for the past 2 years, but now, more and more, she interacted directly with the king. Destin didn't like losing control of that relationship. He never should have allowed her to leave the party. He knew that now. If Lila and Sulhan were both dead, Destin had failed. If they were both alive, Destin had failed. There had been just one verified student casualty. Renard Turant, an Ardenine cadet, went missing that night and was found floating in the Tamron River a few days later, apparently drowned. Destin wished he'd been able to take a little more time dispatching that blundering fool, but he'd been in a bit of a hurry to get out of town before anyone thought to question Dennis Rochefort, a visitor from Arden. It was possible that the scheme had succeeded. It was possible that there had been more than 5 Darians and that the survivors had carried the bodies of Barrowhill and Sulhan away for one of their ghastly rituals. They were blood-hungry bastards, always fighting like jackals over who got to do the deed. Destin preferred a more dispassionate approach to killing. It was sometimes necessary, but Destin didn't enjoy it as a rule. It was possible, but Destin didn't believe it. He'd been promised proof of the kill that he could take back with him to Arden's court, but had not received it. According to his sources, the 2 missing students had not surfaced, alive or dead, in Arden or the Fells in the weeks since. Destin suspected that it was only that bit of hopeful ambiguity that had kept him alive this long. That, and the fact that the deans at Odensford had been unable to prove that Arden was behind it. Oh, they suspected plenty. The Darien Guild was tied to the Church of Malthus, the state church of the Ardenine Empire. The King of Arden had long claimed the right to search the Academy campus for saboteurs, spies, and contraband, though he'd never before tried to exercise that right. The administration at Odensford sent stern letters to the king and to the Principia of the Church of Malthus, demanding to know what, if anything, they knew about the violation of the peace. Since it appeared that those responsible had fled into Arden, they further demanded that the culprits be apprehended and returned to the Academy for trial. Agents of the Church and the Empire denied any knowledge of the attack at the Academy. They pointed out that Arden had no reason to attack students at Odensford, assuming that the school was not harboring enemies of the state. They suggested that they look to the north for the guilty parties. After all, one of the victims was a citizen of Arden. Perhaps the 2 missing students were responsible for the killings. The King of Arden offered to station soldiers at Odensford to protect students and faculty if the Academy requested it. The Academy declined. The king had made his displeasure known since that day. Though just 18, Destin had been considered a rising star and a favorite of the king's, until Odensford. He hadn't had an audience with Montaigne or an assignment from him since. Destin had little to do but worry that the king might show his displeasure in a more concrete way. Some nights, as he lay awake in the stifling heat of the season they called autumn in the south, he considered fleeing the country. His father had anticipated that he might run, and issued a preemptive warning.
"There's no going back from that. The king has a long memory, and Arden has a long reach. It won't be long before the king controls all of the 7 realms. What are you going to do then? Try your luck in Karthus?"
The look in his father's eyes was a threat and a warning and a dare, all in one. And so, finally, this meeting, after weeks of silence. Why now? Destin guessed that the king had reached a decision about his future. So, what's proper dress for one's own execution? Destin wasn't prone to elaborate attire. If he had been, his father would have beaten it out of him long ago. Still, he knew how to present himself well when the occasion demanded it. Black was always in good taste. He dressed head to toe in fine black wool with leather trim. His shirt bore lace at the collar and cuffs. His boots and sword belt were plain, but made of the finest leather. His amulet was tucked discreetly inside his shirt, where it wouldn't be seen, but it would absorb mana in, the demonic energy that oozed from him day and night, like the seepage from a sulphurous spring. Best not to fling that in the king's face, on top of everything else. Being gifted was a double-edged sword in the South. It made Destin and his father useful to the king, but it also made them vulnerable. The Church of Malthus had a habit of burning uncollared wizards, and the king had a habit of letting them do it. Montaigne viewed the gifted in his employ as a necessary evil. Destin studied his image in the glass inside his wardrobe, and was satisfied. This will do to be buried in, he thought, assuming there is enough left to be buried. With that, he went to find his father, who, for once, would be in his apartments. Marin Karn might be general of the Ardenine armies, with quarters in the palace itself, and estates on Arden's Water and at Baston Bay, but when he was in the capital, he could often be found playing cards and drinking in the common room of the barracks, where Destin always felt out of place. Destin saluted the brace of soldiers in front of his father's door. "Can you let the general know I'm here?" That word was conveyed, and Destin was duly admitted to the first waiting room, the first circle in the maze that would eventually lead to his father. When he was finally ushered into his father's privy chamber, he found the general half-dressed, in the process of stripping off his linen shirt.
"Fetch me another,"
he ordered, dropping the shirt on the floor.
"I've sweated through 2 of these already. All of this traveling from the arse-puckering borderlands to the ovens of Bruinswallow will be the death of me."
Promises, promises. Destin crossed to the wardrobe and chose another shirt, then played valet, helping Karn into it. Fetching a towel, he blotted sweat from his father's face and neck. Karn slapped the towel away.
"Stop that," he said. "A man sweats, but maybe you wouldn't know that."
Destin could tell that his father was nervous, because he was being nastier than usual, which meant he was worried about this meeting between his son and the king. Worried that his own position was precarious enough without collateral damage from the failures of his son. At last, the general was committed, laced into his final choice of shirts. Destin handed him his uniform tunic.
"Belt first, then the jacket,"
Karn said through gritted teeth.
"Are you ever going to get that straight?"
"I'm sorry, sir," Destin said stiffly. "I don't often wear a uniform myself, so—"
"Oh, that's right,"
Karn said, as if it had just occurred to him.
"You don't."
Destin clenched his teeth. They could never seem to have a conversation without a dig from his father. Instead of the army, Destin had chosen the clandestine service, which reported directly to the king. Though his rank was lieutenant, he wasn't a real soldier in his father's eyes. Plus, his father didn't like Destin being out from under his direct supervision. Destin, on the other hand, liked it very much. The bells of the cathedral church bonged the quarter hour. "It's nearly time to go," Destin said. "Do you have any advice?" That, in fact, was why he'd come. Somehow his father had managed to survive 30 years in service to this king. He must have developed some sort of strategy.
"Stop quaking like a girl,"
Karn said, his usual disappointment plain on his face. "You are mistaken, General," Destin said evenly. "I am not quaking, merely concerned." Karn snorted. "If the king means to kill you, you'll never see it coming. So relax." That wasn't exactly helpful. "Second thing, whatever the king asks you to do, say yes. If he asks you to dig up your mother and hang her body from the ramparts, say yes. If he wants you to make him a coat from the carcasses of kittens, your answer is yes. If he wants you to kiss his royal ass, say yes. Am I clear?" "Yes," Destin said, then couldn't help adding, "And if he asks me to kill you, should I say yes to that as well?" Their eyes met, held. Then Karn barked out a bitter laugh. "By all means, boy. Do the deed if you think you can pull it off. If you say no, the king will find someone else to kill us both. One of us may as well come out of it alive." Destin and the king were to meet in the royal gardens. King Gerard liked the garden for discussing what he called delicate matters, like assassinations, kidnappings, betrayals, and the like. When it came to keeping secrets, there were fewer eyes and ears in the garden than in the palace. It was also a good place for acting on delicate matters. There was always a risk that if you went into the garden, you wouldn't come out again. Destin awaited the king in the private courtyard that led out to the royal gardens. A raw wind from the north brought the promise of the season they called winter in the south. He shivered, regretting that he hadn't dressed more warmly. Finally, a half-hour past their meeting time, Montaigne descended the steps from the terrace, wearing a nondescript woolen cloak, a hood covering his damp sand hair. He was accompanied by a tall, rangy girl in prim scribe blue. It was Lila Barrowhill. For a long moment, all Destin could do was gape, until he remembered himself, closed his mouth, and went down on one knee. Well, that answered one question at least. She was still alive. "Lieutenant Karn," Montaigne said, waving him to his feet. His cold gaze flicked over Destin, stinging his skin like tiny needles. "Lila and I were just talking about you." "Karn," Lila said heartily. "I've wondered where you've been. How are you?" Destin swallowed hard. "Never better," he lied. He met Lila's gaze. "It's good to see you looking so well." No lie there. She raised an eyebrow. "As opposed to dead?" "As opposed to dead, yes," Destin said. "When you disappeared after that unfortunate incident in your dormitory, I feared the worst." "As I told His Majesty, I feared the worst as well," Lila said. "As you know, the son of one of our military officers died that night," Montaigne said. "Colonel Tourant has been pressing for an inquiry. Lila agreed to answer some of his questions about what happened." Destin stared into Lila's face, trying to read it. So there had been a meeting, one he had not been invited to. That was never a good sign. "Wonderful," Destin said. "I stand ready to be enlightened." He fought the temptation to locate the dagger hidden under the black wool of his tunic, or bolt like a deer through the garden. What had she told the king? Was he dead or alive? Lila leaned against the courtyard pillar. "I think you already know part of the story," she said, "so I'll make it short. When I returned to the dormitory, there were dead bodies all over, and Hansen was missing. I worried that he might be out hunting for me." "For you?" Destin stared at her. I blame myself. I knew he was high-strung and entitled, but I thought he understood that there would never be anything between us. She sighed. It's not like we had anything in common, no chemistry at all. He was all study, 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 talk, 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 and as you know, I like to have a good time. Yes, Destin said, like a dolt. He fancied himself a theologian. Lila rolled her eyes. Always ranting about the evil church of Malthus and how somebody ought to keep the crows, the Malthusian priests, I mean, away from the ford. He kept nagging me to join his little band of fanatics and blow up churches and such. She slid an apologetic look at the king. I know you are a man of faith, your majesty, she said without a hint of irony. But I'm just not interested in religious debates. Besides, I can't afford to get into any more trouble at school. Of course, King Gerard said, his face all sympathetic understanding. Destin cleared his throat. Young Hansen sounds tiresome. Lila nodded. That's what I thought. He was tiresome, but all talk and no action. Lately, he'd been chewing a lot of razor leaf so he could stay awake to study, and he got to acting crazy again, so I finally told him off, the night of Turant's party. I knew he was pissed, but I never expected this. She shook her head sadly. Destin was lost. You never expected... I never expected him to start massacring priests, Lila said. Blood of the martyrs. She thinks Sulhan did the killings? Seriously? Destin studied her face. He saw no evidence of deceit, but he was beginning to realize that Lila was a master liar. Well, he wasn't going to call her on it in front of the king, especially since Montaigne seemed willing to go along. So, Destin said, rubbing his chin, it was Hansen that did it. Lila shrugged. That's my guess, though I don't know how he would have lured priests to the dormitory. I was confused at first, because he didn't use sorcery to kill them. But I think maybe he was trying to prove something, that he could get things done without magic. Because... Destin cocked his head. She flushed. Because, well, I told him that I don't really, consort with mages. No offense, Lieutenant. None taken, Destin said. So, Hansen wasn't among the bodies, then? I didn't see him, but I didn't do a thorough search, Lila said. Like I said, I was worried he might come after me. Plus, I had other plans, and I was afraid I'd be stuck there till solstice answering questions, so I left. Hopefully it'll all blow over before next term. We share that hope, Destin said. He was still trying to get his arms around the fact that Lila Barrowhill had, in all likelihood, saved his life by surviving. Even better, she had deflected blame from Arden by suggesting that Ash Hansen had been responsible for the killing. The only way this disaster could have a better outcome would be if she'd shown up carrying the mageling's head and an apology from the academy. Destin cast about for something to say, some way to repay the favor. I look forward to working with you again this winter, he said. As I told you the last time we met, there are... Actually, I have other plans for you, the king broke in, sending Destin's gut into turmoil once again. That will be all, Lila. I need to speak with the lieutenant in private. They both watched her as she walked away. That was a remarkable story, King Gerard said, when she was out of earshot. Do you think she really believes any of it? It's a plausible story, at least, Destin said. The mage Sulhan was a loner at school, which makes sense for a person trying to hide his real identity. He spent a lot of time with a voyageur, a hedge witch named Taliesin Bogard. Montaigne's mouth twisted. Voyageurs are like rats. Despite all of our efforts to exterminate them, they keep coming back. They are impossible to civilize. Impossible to control, you mean, Destin thought.
We tried to find Bogard after the killings, so we could question her, but she's disappeared as well. That seems suspicious. I'd not heard Sulhan was a zealot, but maybe he picked up some radical ideas from the witch. If so, that's good for us. The deans at the academy don't seem to be aware of any of this, the king said. At least they're not following that line of investigation. I think they decided up front that Arden was responsible, and so they haven't looked further. Besides, apparently Lila didn't report any of this history before she left. He paused. I would advise against sharing it with the school authorities. If she's to be of use to us, it's best if she isn't connected to us in any way. The king considered this for a moment. I agree, he said. The deans have their suspicions, but they can't prove anything. As long as they continue to accept and train our cadets, I don't care what they think. Yes, Your Majesty, Destin said, beginning to hope that he might have dodged the heavy hand of the king's justice. What do you think of Lila? The king asked abruptly. That was a loaded question if Destin ever heard one. She's been reliable so far, he said. She knows everyone at Odin's Ford, and nothing happens that escapes her notice. The war will not be won at Odin's Ford. Maybe not, Destin said, but the academy is a crossroads. Lila travels all over the 7 realms. She speaks multiple languages. She fits in everywhere, and thus far the information she's provided has been on the mark. What is her reputation at school? Was she really as poor a student as she would have us believe? She's in Wien House, as you know. Turant was her class commander, and he had nothing good to say about her. She's been brought up before the dean several times. Turant claimed that it's only the drop in enrollment at the academy that has kept her from being expelled permanently. Perhaps the girl cannot help it, the king mused. I've never believed that women are well suited for the military, but she also could be playing a part for our benefit. What do you think? The military is all about rules, and that's not a good fit for Lila. Besides, I think Turant was a fool. We're better off that he fell into the river before he could reproduce. The king threw back his head and laughed. Ah, Khan, I have missed our conversations. It's just that there are so many claims on my time. Of course, Your Majesty. What's the girl's background? Destin realized that this was more than an interest in Lila. It was a test of his investigative skills. She's a war orphan. She grew up in the Southern Islands, raised by an aunt, then joined another aunt in a smuggling operation along the East Coast. It's a family business. What is a smuggler doing at Odin's Ford? It seems that her family keeps sending her back there, hoping she can make good connections with high-ups in the military. And so she has, Montaigne said, on your recommendation. I interrogated her under persuasion when I brought her on, Destin said. The story she told checks out. I do enjoy having her at court, the king said. She came to dinner last night and had the entire table in stitches, even Lord Madelon. Lila is a reckless wit, Destin said. She says things other people think but don't say out loud. That was always a risk around the king. Montaigne found that kind of candor amusing, until he didn't. I'll need convincing that she can come through with the magecraft we're needing. I don't want an army of uncollared mages running amok in the Empire. I have people in Baston Bay, at Watergate, and in the Southern Islands, Destin said. I'll see what else I can find out. Maybe Lila will be the king's new protégé, Destin thought. The king had a habit of elevating commoners to positions of power at court. They tended to be more beholden and compliant than the nobility, who were used to wielding power on their own. But would he choose a woman for his inner circle?
That would be unprecedented. The king had a habit of playing courtiers against each other. Perhaps it was nothing more than that. Destin liked Lila too, but he didn't trust her.
Come, walk with me.
Montaigne led him out along the low stone wall that divided the formal plantings from the woods beyond. The trees blazed with color against the brilliant sky. The gardens were still overblown with flowers, their scent rank and overpowering, like the smell of decay. The king walked on, moving delicately, like a deer picking its way over rough terrain.
Asters,
he said, sweeping an elegant hand toward some ragged pink and purple flowers along the flagstone path. He picked a few and handed them to Destin, who let them slip from his hand as soon as he could do so surreptitiously. Destin had never known the royal gardens at Ardencourt to be out of bloom. Violas had been his mother's favorites. They were the only flowers he could remember the name of, though Montaigne always repeatedly pointed out and named the others. Perhaps it was because Destin was always distracted in the garden, waiting to find out whom it was he had to kill. By now they'd reached one of the many pavilions that studded the garden, overlooking a pool of stagnant water overgrown with grotesque plants.
"Sit with me,"
the king said, settling onto a bench next to the wall. Destin sat and waited.
"You've been to Carthus, haven't you?"
It was good that Destin was sitting down. The question came like a blow to the head, so unexpected that Destin might have stumbled on the path. That the king had asked it meant that he already knew the answer. But how would he know? It seemed unlikely that Destin's father would have told him.
"Yes, Your Majesty. I lived there for a time as a boy."
My mother and I were so eager to get away from my father that we sailed across the ocean, Destin thought. As it turned out, that wasn't far enough.
"Tell me about it,"
the king said. As always, there was no telling what the king already knew, and what lay behind his questions.
"Well, it's mostly sand and rock," Destin said. "Though it's pretty far north, the ocean currents keep it warm. It's nearly impossible to grow anything, so people are desperately poor. That is why so many have turned to piracy."
Destin was ambushed by memories of the cottage by the sea that he'd shared with his mother, the village where he'd run barefoot through dusty streets. Those had been some of the happiest times of his life.
"Yet I understand that they have very powerful magic there," Gerard said. "They say that's where the mages came from originally."
"That's true in a way, Your Majesty," Destin said.
"Mages originated in the Northern Islands, which, as you know, were once one of the original 7 realms. After the breaking, the islands joined with Carthus. They are still loosely connected, I believe." "Have you been to the islands?" "No, my lord." "Do you speak the language?"
Destin shook his head.
"I used to. I don't really remember it now."
Abruptly, the king changed the subject.
"So, another marching season over, and we are still no closer to our goal," Montaigne said. "I had such high hopes that this would be our breakthrough summer."
Destin didn't risk a reply.
"And yet we have gained no ground," Montaigne said. "I am losing patience. I'm wondering if we need a new strategy."
Does he expect me to defend my father? Actually, my life would be immeasurably improved if he were dead. But Destin knew better than to fall into that trap.
"I wouldn't hazard an opinion on that, Your Majesty. I am no expert on military strategy. I have no doubt that we will prevail in the end, given our superior military and your creative leadership." "I will do whatever it takes to win this war," the king said, his voice low and vicious. "I will break their spirit, and I will break their hearts until the witch in the north kneels to me and begs for mercy. She'll beg, but will receive none." Yes, Your Majesty. I need you to find a girl for me.
This time, Destin managed to navigate the conversational curve.
I'll find a dozen for you, Your Majesty, he replied. What's your pleasure?
Montaigne laughed.
Do you take me for a fool? If I send a young man like yourself out hunting, you'll keep the best for yourself. Your Majesty, I know better than that, Destin said. I would be poor competition for a man like yourself.
That, at least, was true. Montaigne snorted, shaking his head.
No, there's a particular girl I need you to find, if indeed she exists. If she does, she may be in Delphi.
Delphi? Destin struggled to hide his dismay. He'd been to Delphi, too, and his memories of that time were horrifying. He had no desire to go back.
You want me to go to Delphi? That stands to reason, Lieutenant, if I want you to find this girl, and she is there.
I see, Destin said. I wonder if there might be... He trailed off, remembering his father's advice.
Whatever he asks of you, the answer is yes.
He swallowed down his protests and said, Thank you for your confidence in me, Your Majesty. I am eager to serve. The king smiled a thin-lipped smile that said he wasn't fooled.
She would be about 16 years old, and she bears a rune, like so, on the back of her neck.
Montaigne handed Destin a piece of paper with a symbol sketched on it, a spider web of lines framing an arrangement of triangles like a faceted gem. Destin stared at it, ambushed for a second time. His heart began to thud, and he felt strangled, as if he couldn't get his breath. He brushed it with his forefinger, as if he could read it by touch. The symbol was familiar and yet unfamiliar. He swiveled away from the king, staring across the bog to where the meticulously clipped hedgerows ran into the trees. He was glad that it was nearly dark, so that the king could not read his face.
Your Majesty,
he said hoarsely,
if I may ask, who is this girl, and why is she important? She's important to somebody, Montaigne replied. A potential ally from the Northern Islands.
The Northern Islands, Destin repeated, the truth slamming home like a punch to the gut. He turned back toward the king.
But is that wise, Your Majesty? To engage with sorcerers, idolaters, and the like, in a place that has spawned so much evil?
Annoyance flickered across the king's face, and Destin knew he'd made a mistake.
Where do you suggest that I draw the line, mage?
The king's voice crackled with menace.
You wouldn't want to find yourself on the wrong side of it.
No, Your Majesty, I would not,
Destin said hastily. Every day I thank the great saint for your gracious tolerance.
And every day I curse this king's ability to dance on both sides of that line, taking whatever position suits his agenda at the moment.
The fact of the matter is that the Thanes are restive and holding tighter to their purses and their bannermen than in the past. I am tired of crawling to them, begging them to meet their obligations. I need to find a powerful ally, someone who will enable me to field an army that can bring us a decisive win. Finding this girl just might be the key to ending the war in our favor.
We will hope and pray that's the case, Your Majesty, Destin said. How did you learn that the girl is in Delphi?
We don't know for a fact that she is still there, the king said. We know she lived there as a child. It's exceedingly important that no one knows who you are looking for. We don't know what the girl knows. There are 100 holes to hide in Delphi. We don't want her to dive into one of them.
Yes, Your Majesty, Destin said, trying to focus his turbulent mind.
One more thing. We need her alive and unharmed, understand?
So we're not being asked to assassinate this girl?
Precisely.
Things were looking bleaker and bleaker. Destin knew from experience that it was much simpler to kill a person than to capture and transport him without damage. Destin wasn't sure just how far he could push, but he needed all the information he could get. "Do you know what the symbol signifies, or what she looks like? That might make it easier to—"
"I have no idea,"
Montaigne said and shrugged, as if this omission were inconsequential.
"If you find the girl, we'll get some answers directly from her."
"Of course, sire," Destin said, his mind racing. It was either a blessing or a curse that the king had chosen him for this task. He just wasn't sure which.
"You'll be working with Mark Claremont, the captain of my guard in Delphi. He's a man who's willing to take decisive action when it's required. And yet, still that town has never been entirely subdued. There are uprisings every month or two, trouble in the mines, sabotage, smuggling across the border with the Fells. Recently, there was a direct attack on a squadron of guards, killing several. I want you to find out what's going on."
So, you want me to spy on your commander in Delphi, Destin thought, and he, in turn, will be spying on me. There's something to look forward to.
"I'm just wondering, this girl, does she have a name, at least?"
That last sarcastic sentence was out before he could clap his mouth shut. Montaigne fixed his glacial eyes on Destin.
"Her birth name was Jenna Bandelow. Perhaps she's still using it. Her parents were Bill and Ariane. They were old when she was born. They would be quite old now, if they're still alive."
He paused.
"The girl may have been born in Ardenscourt. At least her birth was recorded here. But her parents took her to Delphi when she was still a baby."
The Malthusian friars at Ardenscourt kept meticulous records of births, of people of all stations, complete with birth measurements and identifying marks. That must be how the girl had been discovered.
"Why would anyone move to Delphi?" Destin muttered. "Perhaps they were looking for a place to hide," Montaigne said. "And Delphi would do nicely, don't you think?"
13. The Wayfarer. It was a nasty trick Ash had pulled on Lila, and he knew it. It was an especially low blow after she'd saved his life at Odin's Ford. The truth was, he didn't trust Lila Barrowhill. There was something about the story she'd told that hit his ear wrong, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. She'd seemed overly eager to join up with him and drag him back to the Fells. Maybe she was looking for a reward. Maybe not. Ash had other plans. It seemed that Gerard Montaigne was bent on murdering the entire royal family of the Fells, whether they were in the royal line or not. That meant that his mother and sister were in danger, and he knew of no sure way to protect them save one. He was on his way to Ardenscourt, aiming for the heart of the beast. He planned to stay until Gerard Montaigne was dead, or Ash was dead, or they were both dead. He tried to shut down the voice in his head that said neither his mother nor his sister Lys would make that trade. Well then, he'd make no promises, but he'd survive if he could. He rode into Ardenscourt one morning 2 weeks after he'd left Lila sleeping in the woods. Unlike the mountain towns of the Fells, tucked into valleys, framed by the uplands, Ardenscourt sprawled for miles across the plains of Arden like a Tamric lady's lurid skirt. Ash always found that featureless flatness disorienting. He planned to apply for work with the healing service in the palace. Hopefully that would bring him close enough to the king for his purposes. Since most itinerant healers would not arrive astride a military mount, Ash left his horse in a livery stable on the outskirts of town. It took him half a day to walk from the edge of town to Citadel Hill, Gerard Montaigne's stronghold overlooking the Arden River. As Ash navigated through the twisted, crowded streets, he assessed conditions in the enemy capital with a practiced eye. Soldiers were everywhere, in uniforms of every color, bulling their way through throngs of people, clustering on street corners, spilling from inns and hostelries. Members of the king's guard were thick too, in their black uniforms, hands on the hilts of their swords, eyeing the crowds for signs of trouble. And everywhere, the Church of Malthus, its crow-like priests swishing through the streets, the keys to the kingdom swinging at their waists. The city bristled with temple towers, grim and forbidding. Pickings were slim in the street markets he passed, and prices high, though it was harvest season, and the flatlands of Arden and Tamron had once been the breadbasket of the 7 realms. Street urchins were everywhere, shaking their begging cups, crying out to passers-by. Ash knew better than to give them his coin. They wouldn't be allowed to keep any of it. Besides, any traveler with coin in his pockets became a target for footpads and slide hands. Ash had no stomach for killing thieves. He was hunting bigger game. The blackbirds grew thicker as he neared the citadel gate. A line had formed there, seeking admission to the castle close. Ash merged into it. The southern sun was hot even in this season, and Ash was grateful for the broad-brimmed hat he'd bought to cover his newly mud-dyed hair. The line crept along, processed through by a clutch of blackbirds and a long-nosed steward who checked off names on a list. Most people were being turned away. When Ash reached the front of the line, the officer in charge demanded his name and business. Ash kept his eyes on the ground so that his hat shaded his face.
Adam Freeman, healer, seeking work in the royal service, sir.
Ash touched the brim of his hat. The steward scanned his list.
There's no Adam Freeman on here, he said. As for the infirmaries, Master Merrill prefers to choose his own apprentices. Of course, Ash said. If I could just speak with Master Merrill, perhaps he— Do you have a letter of recommendation? The steward demanded. A diploma from the temple school? I've attended Spiritus, the healer's school at Odin's Ford, Ash said, thinking that Taliesin would be unlikely to give him a recommendation just now. I've not graduated yet, but I do have some skill with— Merrill is a busy man, the steward snapped, eyeing Ash's bulging bags. He does not have time to entertain every traveling herbalist who wants to see the big city. Perhaps one of the country estates would be better suited to your credentials, or lack thereof. He looked over Ash's shoulder. Next. One of the blackbirds gripped his arm, meaning to hustle him on, but Ash set his feet. He was not about to be turned away when he'd waited in line for so long. What about the stables? He blurted. The steward shifted his eyes back to Ash. What about them? He asked in the manner of a man who had lost his patience a long time ago. I meant, do you need help in the stables? Make up your mind, boy, the steward said. Are you a healer or a muck shoveler, or both? The blackbirds all snickered. I'm a healer of horses as well as people, and a farrier too. Ash patted his carry bag. I do have a letter of recommendation from the stablemaster at Fetter's Ford. The steward was already shaking his head, but one of the blackbirds spoke up. Lord Pediman, he said, Marshal Bellamy was complaining last night that the regular farrier got kicked by a horse, and now he's got nobody until the man wakes up, if he ever does. Might be this one could fill in. Pediman took another look at Ash. What was your name again? Adam Freeman. Where are you from? Tamron, but I've travelled to all parts of the Empire. The steward heaved a great sigh. Well, he said in a foot-dragging way, I suppose it couldn't do any harm to let you talk to Bellamy, but if he says no, you will be on your way, understood? Of course. The blackbird who spoke up was detailed to lead Ash to the stables, and presumably to boot him back out of the gate if the master of horse said no. As Ash passed through the outer gate into the bailey, the back of his neck prickled. He'd come there on purpose, but still, he couldn't help but feel like a trap was closing around him. As soon as he set foot in the stables, Ash could tell that it was well managed.
The bedding was fresh, and the horses well-fed, bright-eyed and alert, poking their heads out of their stalls as he passed by. The horse-marshal was outside the granary, arguing with a tradesman.
"This is not what we agreed on,"
Bellamy said. He opened his fist, displaying a handful of oats crawling with weevils.
"You told me this shipment would be clean and free of chaff and straw and dirt. This looks like you scraped it off the floor."
"This is the best I could find," the broker whined. "You try and find quality feed anywhere in the Empire. The army swallows it all up."
"It's your job to find it, not mine," the marshal replied. "I paid a quality price. I should get quality grain. I wouldn't feed this to my worst enemy's dogs. Now take it away."
The broker turned away, still muttering excuses.
"Lord Marshal,"
Ash's blackbird said, giving Ash a push forward.
"This boy says he's a farrier. Does he now?"
Bellamy looked Ash up and down.
"Where have you worked before?" "Odin's Ford and Tamron, sir," Ash said. Digging in his bag, he produced his letter of recommendation. Bellamy scanned the page, then handed it back. "It sounds like you're some kind of miracle worker," he said dryly. "If so, can you conjure up some good grain?" Ash shook his head. "I wish I could, sir." "Well," the marshal said, "let's have a look at your work. Come with me."
When the blackbird made as if to follow, Bellamy put up his hand.
"I'll nanny this one," he said. "I promise I'll toss him back if he doesn't suit me."
He led Ash to a box stall in the rear. As they drew near, a horse poked his head out, ears flat, eyes wide and rolling, snorting his distrust. He was a rich blue roan with black points, not the standard dun color typical of Ardenine military mounts. Ash stopped a short distance away, setting down his bags. He could smell infection from where he stood.
"What's going on?"
he murmured, more to the horse than to Bellamy, but Bellamy answered.
"He's a 3-year-old, and he's been out on campaign all summer," Bellamy said. "Came back in a foul mood that's just gotten worse. He's favoring his right front leg, but nobody can get near enough to take a look. My farrier was the last one that tried, and he got kicked in the head for his trouble. Now he's off his feed, and I'm worried he'll go down for good."
The farrier or the horse, Ash thought of saying, but didn't.
"What was he like before he left in the spring?" "He's a good horse," Bellamy said a bit defensively. "He was always willing if you knew how to manage him. Oh, you know, like most horses, he'd get away with whatever he could, but he was never mean-tempered, not like this."
Ash liked the fact that Bellamy stood up for his horse.
"How long has he been off his feed?" "Couple weeks."
"What's his name?"
"Crusher."
Ash raised an eyebrow.
"Crusher."
At the sound of his name, the gelding's ears pricked forward. Bellamy grimaced.
"He's a war horse, all right. Man doesn't want to ride into battle on a horse named Daisy." "You have a point." Ash stood, hands on hips, studying the horse, noting his prominent backbone and ribs. "He's lost weight?"
Bellamy nodded.
"I'd say so."
"Has anyone checked his teeth?" Bellamy rubbed the bridge of his nose.
"Be my guest."
Ash laughed. He liked the horse-marshal. He couldn't help it.
"Maybe later, after we've gotten to know each other. Anyway, like I told you, the problem seems to be in his foreleg."
Ash squatted and rooted through his carry-bag, finally coming up with an apple he'd picked along the road. He crossed to the stall, moving slowly and deliberately, avoiding eye contact with the gelding. Still, the ears went back again, and the roan showed his teeth. When he shied back, Ash could see how he favored his right foreleg.
"Hey, now,"
Ash murmured, keeping the apple out of sight.
"Something's hurting you, isn't it? No wonder you're snarly. But you know, we're just trying to help."
The ears flicked forward again, and the gelding's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the apple. It was a good sign that he was still interested in food. Ash just kept talking, keeping up a gentle one-way conversation as he watched the gelding's neck muscles relax. Finally, he extended his flat hand, the apple centered on his palm, and Crusher lipped it up and crunched it between his teeth, his whiskers tickling a little. Behind him, Bellamy released a long breath he'd been holding. Ash let Crusher snuffle the back of his hand, then scratched him all along his neck and withers, trickling soothing power through his fingers, relieving the white-hot pain that coursed through the horse. Before long, the roan was pushing with his nose, wanting more. After a few minutes, Ash unbolted the lower stall door, pulled it open, and stepped into the stall. Crusher's tail clamped down, ears back again. "It's just me," Ash murmured. "You know me, don't you?" Another 10 minutes of work, and Ash had the halter on him and his head secured. After that, it was a matter of persuading the gelding that it was a good idea to allow Ash to pick up his foot. It helped that he could all but eliminate the pain. Unfortunately, that required that he take it on himself. Fortunately, Ash had a high threshold for pain. He examined the hoof, which badly needed picking out. The shoes were nearly worn through. This horse had been ridden hard. The hoof was hot, the pulse fever-fast above the fetlock. Pus oozed from a crack along the white line and around one of the nails. Ash looked up at Bellamy. "It's an abscess," he said. "I'm going to drain it. If you look in my carry bag, you'll find—" "Not that one!" he all but shouted. Bellamy looked up, startled. That's all I need, Ash thought, to have the king's horse-marshal pull an array of shivs and poisons out of my travel bag. "The other one. Look for a white bag labeled horse mustard. Measure out a cup, thoroughly wet it with water, then bring it to me." By the time he'd finished with the roan, Ash had a job in the stables and a cozy room next to Bellamy's. He'd hoped to be housed inside the keep, and he'd rather it wasn't next to Bellamy's, but he could hardly complain. "It's just a shame," Ash said as he repacked his supplies. "This has been festering for a long while. If it had been caught early, it could have been handled, and this horse spared a lot of pain. Now he'll be out of commission for months. I intend to give the owner an earful about taking better care of his horse on the road." "Well," Bellamy said, a peculiar expression on his face, "it's up to you, but I wouldn't do that." Ash stared at the marshal, surprised. He didn't seem like the kind of person who'd shy away from a hard conversation. "Why not?" "This horse belongs to His Majesty, the King of Arden." 14. Exiled in Delphi. Destin Carn was tired of looking for Jenna Bandelow. After a month in this hellhole of Delphi, he was no closer to finding her than when he'd arrived. He understood the price of failure. He'd claimed it often enough on behalf of the crown. The worst of it was, there was no guarantee success was even possible. There was no way to know if the girl was still alive or still in Delphi. It occurred to him that the king had set him an impossible task on purpose, like in that old ballad where the elfin knight asks a maid to make him a shirt without thread or needle. Then Montaigne had sent him to do it in the most miserable place in the empire. And if he found the girl, what then? What would it mean for his own future, for the hope he still carried in his heart? Destin drained his tankard of ale and slammed it down on the table, the noise lost in the din of the room. The metal left a raw gash in the battered wood. Mark Claremont, the captain of the King's Guard, laughed and signaled to the server to bring another round. "This place grows on you, boy," he said, "like a nasty boil. The only thing that helps is ale and stingo." He shoved his chair back and rested his hand suggestively on the hilt of his sword. "When things get really bad, I just kill a few Delphian rats. That never fails to raise my spirits." An impossible task, in a miserable place, with despicable help. The only thing that might raise Destin's spirits was to find a way to get rid of Claremont. Delphi was a dangerous place, after all. The thought made him smile, drawing a wary look from the captain of the guard. Destin raised his refilled tankard and winked at him. His mood was so black that getting murdered was beginning to seem appealing. He and Claremont were seated at a table in a corner of a crowded tavern, but there was a cushion of space about them, an invisible boundary no one cared to cross. The tavern was called the Mug and Mutton, and it drew a mixed crowd, miners and soldiers intent on heavy drinking, furnacemen and ironworkers having a night out, plus a sprinkling of travelers who, against all reason, had actually chosen to come to Delphi. Destin's father had been posted here a few years ago to put down yet another revolt. Destin had come along, unwilling then as now to serve as the general squire and punching bag. It wasn't long after he and his mother had been dragged back from their refuge in Carthus.
"It's time we got to know each other, boy," his father had growled. "Your mother's done her best to ruin you, but I'll make a man of you yet."
His memories of Delphi were nightmarish. Aside from the absence of his father, it was even worse now than he remembered. Much of it had to do with the commander of the King's Guard. Claremont never reined in his blackbirds, who roamed the city like predators, picking off the vulnerable. They used the search for the rune-marked girl as an excuse to drag women into back alleys in order to examine them. When Destin argued that this was counterproductive, Claremont just laughed.
"It's cold up here, Lieutenant. The men need to stay warm somehow."
It would do no good to report it to the king. King Gerard was unlikely to buy Destin's theory that the city seethed with rebellion because Claremont was too cruel, as opposed to not cruel enough. Meanwhile, Ardenine assets blew up and burned on a regular basis. Miners had ready access to explosives, and they seemed to know how to use them. Montaigne didn't care about process. He valued results, and so far Destin had nothing to show. If he was ever to get out of Delphi, he had to work smarter. He knew he'd been going about his mission in a haphazard manner, but he couldn't think of a way to put a method in it. He'd called in a whole series of Delphians, miners and shopkeepers, smelters and serving girls, and government officials. He'd questioned them all. Destin was a gifted interrogator, a valuable resource at Montaigne's disposal. That made torture unnecessary for the most part, unless he was dealing with other mages who could resist his mind magic. People talked to Destin, and they told the truth. And then he wiped their minds, and they didn't remember what he had asked, or what they had revealed. That singular talent had been the key to his rapid rise in the clandestine service. Yet, so far, his talent for interrogation had turned up nothing of value in Delphi, save the odd black marketeer or other small-time schemer. If the rune-marked girl was known, it was only to a few. No one could recall a family named Bandolo, and no one seemed to know anything about a girl with a birthmark on her neck. It didn't help that it was the custom in Delphi for women to wear their hair long, and most wore heavy black scarves to keep the coal dust out while they worked in the mines or walked the streets. That made any casual survey impossible. Why couldn't this girl have a mage mark on her nose? Sleet rattled against the tin roof of the building. Destin had just finished his 4th ale, and soon he would have to go out into the storm again.
"It could be worse," Claremont said, scratching his crotch. "You could be in the fells, fighting monsters and demons. They say a man might as well fall on his sword as march into those cursed mountains." He snorted. "The stripers are just as terrified as the recruits. Course stripers couldn't find their manhood with both hands in their breeches and a map. Those black-robed crows of Malthus can prattle on about martyrdom and paradise all they want. I'm not signing on."
Destin shrugged, the safest response. He couldn't decide which was worse, listening to Claremont or going out to the freezing privy. Difficult choice.
"The devil of it is, the fells is ruled by a woman," They say she wears armor and plays soldier. The Northerners spend their days picking wildflowers and dreaming, and their nights fornicating under the stars. They're just a bunch of pretenders and mystics."
"So why aren't we in Fellsmarch by now?" Destin said bluntly, thinking dreaming and fornicating sounded a hell of a lot more appealing than where he was now.
"We've got to stop believing our own propaganda and take the Witch Queen seriously."
"Cheer up,"
Claremont said. "This girl you're looking for probably died years ago, if she was ever here."
"Keep your voice down,"
Destin hissed, looking around to make sure no one had overheard. The more Claremont drank, the louder he talked. Still, he had a point. Children died in droves in Delphi.
"I don't know why it's such a secret," Claremont said. "All you do is you post up notices all over town, demanding her surrender, then execute the vermin, one a day, until she turns up, or we run out of vermin. Either way, we win."
Destin became aware that someone was standing silently before him. One of the servers had finally dared approach, but could not bring herself to interrupt.
"Yes, what is it?"
he snapped, and then, when he really looked at her, he realized she was young, with silken blonde hair and frightened blue eyes. He'd never seen her before, so she must be new.
"I wondered if you all would be wanting more ale,"
she said nervously, in the soft cadence of the borderlands.
"Or perhaps some supper, now or later on?"
She set their empty tankards on the tray she carried. Destin smiled at her, trying to reassure her.
"I've had enough ale,"
he said. He turned toward Claremont in time to see him push to his feet, grasp a handful of the server's hair and force her to her knees. The tankard slid off the tray and onto the wooden floor as the tray went vertical.
"Here's an idea, Lieutenant,"
Claremont said. Still holding on to her scalp, he drew his knife with his other hand. The girl saw the blade and let out a little cry of fright. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Destin half rose from his chair.
"Claremont, have you lost your bloody mind?"
Claremont wrapped the hair around his hand. The knife swept across, and then he opened his fist and allowed the golden hair to slide to the floor. 2 more quick cuts, and she was left with a ragged helmet of hair, like some knight's unkempt page. He shoved her head forward, almost to the floor, so he could examine her neck. Nothing there.
"Guess she aren't the one," he said, shrugging. "Oh, well."
He sat down again, resheathing his blade. The server remained on her knees, tears streaking through the paint on her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs, not making a sound. The tavern had gone remarkably silent around them. Destin looked from the terrified girl to Claremont and back again, speechless with mingled relief and disgust. It was just as well he was speechless, since Claremont technically outranked him. After a moment, he leaned forward and put 2 fingers under the server's chin, so that she opened her eyes.
"You're all right," he muttered. "It's just hair."
He jerked his head, giving her permission to go. The girl picked up the tray and the tankards.
"Thank you, my lord,"
she murmured, her lip quivering. She didn't look grateful, though, and she moved away quickly. Her hair remained, like pale gold threads scattered on the battered plank floor.
"Maybe I shouldn't have done that,"
Claremont mused.
"We'll be lucky if we get another drink all night." "You're right," Destin said. "You shouldn't have done that. And I shouldn't have to remind you that the marked girl is not to be harmed in any way." Still, the episode of the hair had given him an idea. Not foolproof, but better than the strategy so far, which was none, and less dangerous than turning the blackbirds loose on the populace. "Claremont, could you set up a meeting with the mayor, tomorrow if possible?" "Why?"
Claremont's eyes narrowed.
"What do you want me to tell him?"
"Let's surprise him, shall we?" 15. A Deal with the Devil. Lila dressed carefully in her cellar room. It was small, but at least she had it to herself. Suitable attire was always a challenge at Arden's because other women at court were either fine ladies or maidservants. Lila had no template to follow. She'd finally hit on a kind of uniform, an overdress in the same sober blue that court scribes wore. She laced it over a long-sleeved linen shirt and black underskirt. The result was a prim schoolteacher look, like a dedicate in one of the more lenient churches. Having hit on that, she had several made. Her dark skin helped her blend into a servant class that was mostly made up of races from the conquered lands to the south. With any luck, her Ardenine colleagues would forget she was a woman at all. To the nobility, she was a trader and smuggler. They had come to rely on her as a person who could, despite the war, procure most anything desired by people in the south, who were used to getting what they wanted: clan-made jewelry, remedies, perfumes, tack and leather goods, the scrying balls that allowed bored Ardenine ladies to look ahead and see their boring futures. She evaluated herself in the looking-glass by the door, careful to tuck her serpent's tooth talisman into the neckline of her shirt. Crafted of rowan, ebony, and ivory, it had been given to her by her clan friend and sometime partner, Shadow Dancer. It had proven itself once again when Destin cornered her and questioned her with persuasion soon after the meeting in the garden. Then he'd disappeared. Try as she might, she hadn't been able to learn anything about his whereabouts. She hoped he still lived. She'd stuck out her neck to save him, after all. Though, truth be told, she had enjoyed his flustered reaction to her story about the princeling's fit of crazy. Hearing the temple bell mark the quarter hour, Lila knew it was time to go. Slinging her carry-bag over her shoulder, she bolted out the door. She'd been called to a meeting with the king and Marin Karn, the general of the southern armies and the architect of the war against the Fells. She'd not met the general before, since Lila usually came to Arden's court during the marching season, when General Karn was in the field. She tried to tell herself that this was what she'd wanted all along, to be allowed the kind of access that would enable her to play the big game. But she missed having the insulation of Destin Karn between her and the king. She moved through the corridors at a trot, afraid she'd taken too much time primping, worried she'd be late. She climbed the stairs from the cellar and passed swiftly through the labyrinth of echoing, marble-faced hallways, intentionally confusing to the untutored, until she reached the unmarked entrance to the king's apartments. The blackbirds at the door were familiar, Fleury and Desjardins. Though Lila was taller than many, Fleury could have made 3 of her. He wore a wicked-looking sword strapped to his waist, and the black of the king's guard. Desjardins was a collared mage, pinch-faced and wary, a slave. Lila tucked her carry-bag more securely under her arm.
"What's in the bag, girl?"
Fleury demanded. He knew her name, but never used it. Lila thrust her carry-bag toward him, knowing there was no getting out of it. "Have a look," she said, avoiding Desjardins' eyes. Fleury poked through the bag, smirked at Desjardins, and handed it back.
"Search her,"
he said to Desjardins. The wizard patted her down thoroughly. He found nothing, of course. Lila had brought no weapons, knowing they'd only be taken away from her. Gripping Lila's wrists, he sent a tendril of power in.
"Tell the truth," he said softly. "Why are you here?"
"I'm here to meet with the king," Lila said. "We have business."
"Do you intend harm to His Majesty, or any close to him?"
"No," Lila said. "I do not.
Not today, anyway.
"Are you carrying any weapons or poisons that I did not discover?"
"No," Lila said, her fingers going numb from the pressure of the mage's hands. The talisman at her neck sizzled against her skin, protection against magic. Desjardins turned to Fleury.
"Is there anything else?"
he asked. Fleury shook his head, and Desjardins released her. Fleury gestured to Greenberry, the chamberlain, who disappeared inside.
A moment later he returned, saying, "The king will see you now."
He shoved open the door, and Lila proceeded into the king's apartments. A map of the kingdom and surrounding territories covered one wall. Large arched windows at either end of the room were designed to catch any breeze during the stifling heat of the southern summer. It had been a warm day for the time of year, and the shutters stood open, admitting the failing light. The room was furnished sparingly. A small conference table was set up next to the fireplace, with 3 men ranged around it, bottles and glasses in front of them, though it was just mid-morning. There were no servants in evidence, only the usual flock of blackbirds by the door. It was to be a very small meeting, then. One of the men at the table was Michel Beaudetort, a thane Lila had worked with in the past, a thane whose unflinching loyalty to the king had won him lands and titles at the expense of less pliant nobles. The other, a stocky, middle-aged man, must be Marin Karn, the butcher, as he was affectionately known. The third man was Gerard Montaigne, King of Arden. Lila crossed to within 20 feet, then assumed the position. The king waved her to her feet.
"Please," he said, "let's keep it informal. Be at ease."
As if that were possible in the presence of this king. This morning the king wore an elegant pearl-gray doublet over a shirt and charcoal trousers. His hands were manicured, the nails buffed to a soft shine. The heavy gold chain around his neck bore his device of office. It would be a mistake to think of the king as an easy mark. An ornate blade leaned against the wall behind him, and even at a distance, Lila could tell that it had seen heavy use. She'd heard from reliable sources that the king was a deadly swordsman, and he rarely went unarmed, which, considering his history, was no doubt a good idea. Next to the elegant king, Marin Karn was a stocky plug of a man with snuff-colored eyes. His uniform was a poor fit, straining across his back and shoulders. Perhaps he was getting fleshy in his middle age, but Lila guessed it was mostly muscle. He'd still be deadly in a fight, especially since he wore the glow that said he was gifted. She couldn't help comparing him with Destin. The only resemblance Lila could see between father and son was that they shared the same tawny brown hair color. At least she guessed they did. The general's was clipped so short that it might have been a stain on the top of his head. Destin had the lithe strength of an acrobat or dancer. He reminded Lila of the clan runners who could cover miles without stopping. Put him in student's robes and he would look bookish. Dress him in finery and he would break hearts at court. In peasant garb, he would blend into any crowd. You have no idea who he is, Lila thought. He's a role player, just like you. Never forget that. With some effort, Lila forced herself to focus on the Karn in front of her, Marin. That Karn had been taking his own long look at Lila, and it seemed he was not impressed.
"This is your smuggler, Beaudetort."
Lila noticed that he directed his skepticism to the thane rather than to his king.
"I've been working with Lila for 3 years," Beaudetort said, "and she's never disappointed me." "Really?" Karn said, snorting. "Women disappoint me all the time."
Perhaps the fault isn't in the women, but in you, General, Lila thought, but somehow it came out of her mouth. They all froze, staring at her. Several of the blackbirds put their hands on the hilts of their swords, their eyes sliding to Karn to see what he would do. Karn moved fast for a large man. Erupting from his chair, he gripped the front of Lila's blouse and yanked her close so they were nose to nose.
"What did you say?"
Well, that's a good start, Lila thought. The only thing more frightening than Marin Karn at a distance was Karn up close. Don't show fear, don't show fear, don't show fear. She looked into Karn's tobacco eyes and said, "Forgive me, General, if I've offended. I only meant that it would be a rare woman who could hope to be a suitable match for you." She snapped her mouth shut, unsure whether she'd made things better or worse. Stop spilling scummer, Lila, or you're the one will be knee-deep in it. After what seemed like a lifetime of silence, the King of Arden began to laugh. Once started, he laughed so hard that tears leaked from his eyes. Just like that, the cord of tension snapped.
You have to admit, Khan, she has a point,
he said, swiping his eyes with his sleeves. But Karn wasn't admitting anything.
The bitch has a mouth on her that's going to cost her if she isn't careful.
He'd gotten the message, though. Releasing his grip on Lila, he stalked back to the table and dropped into his chair.
Bodetort.
Montaigne nodded toward the door.
Leave us. We'll talk later.
Bodetort wanted to stay, Lila could tell, but he seemed to know better than to object. He bowed out of the room. They must have decided that Lila posed no threat, because Karn sent the blackbirds out too. There was an empty chair now, but nobody invited Lila to sit. She was tempted to sit down anyway, but wasn't sure how far she could push these two. So she stood behind it, resting her hands on the back. Anyway, she thought better on her feet. With no further ceremony, the king nodded to Karn to proceed.
Where are you from, girl?
Karn studied her through heavy-lidded eyes. I grew up in the Southern Islands, General.
And yet, I believe you're of mixed blood.
Aye, my father was a soldier. He wasn't around much.
Ah,
Karn said, nodding as if he understood, which he didn't.
A sellsword, then. Who did he fight for?
Lila met his gaze. The Fells. That is one reason I am fluent in that language. But I work for myself. You could call me a sellsword, although I believe my talents would be wasted on a battlefield. Montaigne and Karn looked at each other.
Well, then,
the king said.
Did you bring the collar that you mentioned?
Aye, Your Majesty. As you know, I've been able to source magical tools from time to time in the past, but it's very hard to get. The clans are wary of letting go of flashcraft these days, since they worry that it might make its way to Arden. But I do have a piece to show you, with your permission. Lila patted her carry-bag.
Please.
Unfastening the flap, Lila reached inside and pulled out a collar made of beaten silver, its dull finish inscribed with blackened runes. She extended it toward the king, but he yanked his hands back and shook his head.
Have a look, Khan.
He's a cautious bastard, Lila thought, for about the 100th time. Karn took the collar and turned it in his hands, examining it on all sides. It took on a glow as he sent power into it, testing it.
It is flashcraft, Your Majesty. Copperhead made.
But it looks old, like a vintage piece.
It is, Lila said. It dates from the Wizard Wars. It's more than 1,000 years old. Karn looked up sharply.
Is it now? Where did you get this?
Lila shifted her eyes away. I have a contact who can supply flashcraft now and then. Not just collars. Talismans, magical armor, and amulets. Karn unfastened the catch and opened the collar, snapped it shut again, tried the connection.
Who is this contact, and where does he get the merchandise?
I don't know, Lila said, but he is trustworthy.
Trustworthy?
Montaigne said, raising an eyebrow.
Is there really such a person?
What I mean is, he knows better than to cross me. Karn rolled his eyes, as if he found that hard to believe.
We would rather work directly with your contact, he said.
First of all, this person doesn't want to meet either of you, Lila said, feeling sweat trickling down between her shoulder blades. Second of all, if he traveled south, people would wonder why. As a student and a soldier, I have an excuse.
He's a swiving copperhead,
Karn said, like a trout striking a fly.
Isn't he? That's why he can't come to us.
Lila hesitated just long enough to confirm it. Understand his position. He's taking a huge risk as it is. Montaigne splashed more whiskey into his glass.
Well, Con, what do you think?
The general fixed Lila with his muddy eyes.
I think a trickle of flashcraft doesn't do us any good. We need a source who can supply a large number of callers right now. If you're as good as you think you are, you will find a way to make that happen. Otherwise, we're not interested.
How many callers were you thinking of?
500 to start.
500? Lila stared at him. It's not like we're running a factory, and if we divert that number of callers, people will notice.
Let them notice, Karn said, as long as we get the callers first. If you come through on this, it won't matter. If you don't...
He bared his teeth in a feral smile that was scarier than any scowl Lila had ever seen.
Consider this a test, girl. A demonstration of your abilities.
Lila took a breath, then let it out slowly before answering. It'll be pricey. I'll need to be compensated for the loss of future business from this source.
I have no doubt we can meet your price, Montaigne said.
That's odd, Lila thought, given that I've heard your coffers are empty. Of course, there's no need to pay a dead person. It will take me a while to make arrangements, Lila said, her mind racing. She needed to reach Shadow Dancer. She needed to do it without risking being traced or followed.
Just don't take too long, Karn said, or we'll find somebody else.
No worries, General, Lila said, reaching for the collar he was still toying with. Karn yanked it back.
I'll keep this, he said. I want to study it more carefully.
You'll have it wrapped around some poor wizard's neck before the day is out, Lila thought. As you wish, Lila said. I will keep you up to date on my progress. As she took her leave, the king and his general already had their heads together, talking. This meeting had spawned more questions than answers. What could they possibly want with 500 callers? Where did they expect to find that many wizards to enslave? Was this a piece of a plan to invade the Fells? She had no idea. There was one thing she did know. She'd made a deal with the devil, something she might regret. 16. Officer of the Crown. When Jenna shouldered her way into Fletcher's tack and harness, Fletcher was at his workbench, buffing a pair of boots. 3 old men clustered around the coal stove, claw-like hands extended, staying warm. A young man leaned against the counter, waiting for a pickup. She stole a second look. Yes, he was a mage, which meant he must be in the army or the guard. The harness shop was one of the few businesses in Delphi that catered to everybody, citizens, miners, travelers, blackbirds, and dirtbacks. Anybody who needed any kind of leather goods, shoes, scabbards, gloves, and harness passed through here. It was usually repair, because most people couldn't afford to buy new. Aside from the inns and taverns, it was one of the best places to get the news. Since Britt Fletcher took it over 3 years ago, it had also become headquarters for the Patriots.
Riley,
Fletcher said, looking up and smiling.
I never see enough of you these days.
'Cause every time I come in here, it costs me money,
Jenna said in her gruff boy voice. She held up a leather pouch, the kind she used to carry blasting powder.
Can you fix this? I burned 2 holes in it on accident.
Sure thing, Fletcher said. I'll write it up soon as I finish up with the lieutenant here.
Lieutenant? Jenna slid another look at the young man at the counter. He was young for a lieutenant, if that's what he was, not much older than she was. He was dressed for the weather, but his heavy coat had no insignia on it that she could see. It looked new and finely made. The bit of fur around the hood said it cost real money.
Take your time,
Jenna said, turning away from the lieutenant and toward the stove, where the 3 idlers sat stiffly, pretending not to pay attention to the officer, but all of them stealing looks when they could. Fletcher clunked the boots on the counter.
Here you go, Lieutenant. I think you'll find these warmer than the ones you had, and the soles will be better on the snow."
"I hope so," the lieutenant said, pulling out his purse. "What do I owe you?" Jenna couldn't help herself. She turned to gape. Fletcher snorted.
"Claremont didn't tell you? The King's Guard don't pay for nothing here in town."
"What?" The lieutenant looked up sharply.
"Why not? Do you run a tab, or—" "You're here for our protection, aren't that so?" Fletcher drawled. "So you just take whatever you want for the good of us all."
"I don't," the young lieutenant said flatly. "What do I owe you?" Fletcher's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He thought a moment.
10 steelies,
he said. While the officer counted out the coins, Fletcher leaned his elbows on the counter and said,
"So, you're an officer of the Crown, huh? You must be the Lieutenant Khan on this notice here that's in charge of this hygiene thing. The one that'll be approving all the coming and going from town."
Fletcher jerked his thumb at a placard on the wall just inside the door. Jenna hadn't noticed it when she walked in. She could read the headline from where she stood. "By order of the Health Minister, Health and Hygiene Measures."
"I am,"
the officer said. He didn't seem all that eager to own up to it.
"Glad to hear that the King has taken an interest in our health and hygiene," Fletcher said.
The lieutenant smiled. At least his lips did, but the rest of his face was blank as any stone wall.
"Good day,"
he said, and walked out of the shop. When Jenna was sure he was gone, she crossed to where she could read the whole notice. Due to a recent outbreak of plague among soldiers of His Majesty's army, and for protection of the citizens of Delphi, the ministry has ordered the following. Item 1. The gates to the city have been closed, and will remain closed until the outbreak has been contained. All travelers and citizens leaving the city will be required to show proof of medical treatment prior to departure. All permissions will be issued by Lieutenant Destin Karn, Officer of the Crown. Item 2. Because the plague is thought to be carried by fleas that dwell in ladies' hair, all female citizens of Delphi ages 12 and up are hereby ordered to report to hygiene stations that have been set up throughout the city. Their hair will be shorn, washed with a medical soap, and examined for vermin. Each woman so treated will be affixed with silver earrings to signify that she has complied. Item 3. Any man with hair longer than 4 inches will be similarly treated. Item 4. Treatments are to commence immediately and are to be completed before the solstice holiday. Item 5. Any woman in the city who has not completed treatment by then will be subject to fines and imprisonment.
"Scummer,"
Jenna muttered.
Plague? You know anybody that's got the plague?
"Nah,"
Fletcher growled. "They're looking for something or someone. Just don't know what. Now what you got for me, Riley?"
Jenna leaned across the counter, the powder bag between them.
"How long will it take to fix this?"
she said loudly, then whispered.
"There's 2 mudback wagons coming up the south road day after tomorrow, about supper time."
"Cargo?"
Fletcher's voice was terse.
"Powder, weapons, dry goods," Jenna murmured. "Heard 2 soldiers talking about it in the Mug and Mutton earlier today."
"I don't know that this is worth fixing," Fletcher said. "But if you insist, I'd say in a week." "A week? Do you want me to write it up or not?"
"Never mind,"
Jenna grumbled, picked up the sack, and turned to go. Message delivered. That wagon would never reach headquarters.
"You be careful now, you hear?"
Fletcher called after her. He always said that when she went out the door. All the way back to the Lady of Grace, Jenna turned over what had happened in the harness shop. At first, she'd just been annoyed at this new intrusion into daily life in Delphi. But now she fingered the mage mark on the back of her neck and wondered, after all these years, could somebody be looking for her? As soon as the idea surfaced, Jenna dismissed it. You've got to stop listening to your Da's stories, she thought. There's no need for made-up monsters. We have enough of those in real life. She had no magical destiny. There was only the here and now. She'd learned that when Riley died. That night, she bathed and washed her hair, despite the blizzard raging outside. She scrubbed at the back of her neck, like she always did, as if she could wash the mage mark off. But all that came off was coal dust. Her room up under the eaves was poorly insulated, and the wind came through sometimes, as if the walls weren't even there. A small stove squatted in one corner of the room, with a pipe through the roof to carry away the smoke. It took the chill off and allowed her to heat water for tea or bathing. She always tried to end the day clean, and sleep clean. Clean once in a day would have to be enough in Delphi. Once a day she could leave off the various roles she played all day long: Mind Blaster, Saboteur, Spy, and be herself, whoever that was. It was getting hard to remember. She never saw the girl she really was reflected in someone else's eyes. That girl had disappeared a long time ago. When Jenna finished with her hair, she lifted the teapot from the stove and poured hot water over the leaves, loose in the cup. She never needed a fistful of rags to protect her hands when she stoked the stove, moved pots around, or detonated a charge. Her Da said that when she was little, she'd pull buns out of the oven with her bare hands and scrape cookies off a hot pan. Now she curled into a chair and sat, staring out at nothing, the warm cup between her hands. It was a fine china cup. She could trace the designs of blown roses on it. It had belonged to her mother, the woman who mothered her in every way except by blood. Jenna always used the same cup, rinsing it out carefully each night. She had few things to remember her mother by, and there wasn't much that was beautiful in Delphi. Jenna heard him knock, a quick, muted staccato pattern that said he was alone, and it was all right to open the door. Sighing, she set the cup aside and moved to the door, her slippered feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She undid the lock and pulled it open so that he could enter. Her father was carrying a plate of food, sliced chicken and potatoes and carrots, with a large hunk of bread alongside. It was a lot of food for anyone in Delphi, one of the benefits of being the daughter of an innkeeper. He set it on the small table next to her chair and kissed her on the forehead. He held her tight for a moment, and then stepped back so he could look at her. He looked tired, and his face was creased with worry lines. They were permanent by now. Jenna drew in a quick breath. Her father would soon be gone, and she would be alone. She shook her head fiercely, dismissing the thought, and he stared at her, puzzled. She summoned a smile.
You always bring too much food, Da. Who do you think you're feeding up here? 2 strapping sons?
She spoke quietly, so the sound wouldn't carry beyond the walls of the room. She sat back down in the chair and began to eat. She didn't believe in wasting food, even though her stomach was tied up in a knot. Her father sat in the other chair, the one reserved for him. No one else ever came to visit.
You need to put some flesh on your bones, girl, he said. If your mother could see you, she'd say I've neglected you.
She would say no such thing,
she snorted. This was one of their rituals. She cut the chicken into bite-sized pieces and lifted one of them to her mouth. He watched her eat in silence for a while. When she slowed to picking, he reached inside his jacket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it and handed it to her. She scanned it and handed it back, nodding.
I saw it. Who knew that we had a health minister in Delphi? And I wonder who's paying for all that silver. Us, probably.
He didn't say anything for a moment, as if saying it aloud would call the demon.
Do you think this has anything to do with you?
She looked down at her hands.
I don't have vermin,
she said, misunderstanding on purpose.
What if they're looking for the mage mark?
He leaned forward, his face prepared for pain.
You're never going to get past that old witch and her stories, are you, Father? We've been living scared all our lives because of her. Why did you even listen to her?
Her father made a sign to avert evil.
She was your grandmother, Jenna.
So she said.
I believed her,
her father said.
I am convinced that she was truly trying to protect you. She cared about you, if I'm any judge, and she seemed to be scared to death. She said your father was dead, that he had enemies who would come looking for you, and they would know you by the mark on the back of your neck. That's why she gave you up. That's why she warned us.
For all we know, she stole me from my birth parents and didn't want them to find me. You are my father, and my mother is buried here in the graveyard. That's who I honor on the Day of the Dead.
Jenna realized her voice was rising and stopped speaking for a moment.
You are all I need, she continued quietly.
He sighed.
We should never have allowed the monks to record your birth. We were just so anxious to have you officially ours, afraid you'd be taken away from us. And Delphi seemed so far away from Arden at the time.
It was an old story. They lived their lives in little circles, always rounding back to the same fears, the same conversations.
Da, she said softly. I don't have time to worry about bogies and witch marks. If somebody's looking for me, it won't be because of some age-old curse. It'll be because I've been betrayed, because somebody tipped off the blackbirds.
That's another thing. I wish you wouldn't do the things that you do. That's surely a job for someone else. You're getting to an age that you should be thinking about marriage and family.
How am I supposed to walk out with anybody when I'm dressed like a boy all the time? Jenna snapped. Anyway, why would I bring a child into a world like this?
This can't last forever, her father said. Things will change. The Maker
helps those who help themselves. Isn't that what you always said? Things will change if we change them.
Still, nobody takes the risks that you take. Sooner or later, the blackbirds will put 2 and 2 together.
Jenna sighed. She tried to keep her father in the dark about some of her activities, at least.
Everything's a risk, she said. Is it less risky for a woman to walk down any street in the city? Is it less risky to work the mines every day, laying charges and setting them off? If not for Riley, I'd be dead already.
That's why every day is a gift from the Maker, her father said. Don't waste them in a futile cause. It won't bring Riley back.
I'm not just doing this for Riley. I'm doing this for me, for you, and for everyone who suffered at the hands of King Gerard. I don't have time to worry about made-up demons when there's a real one sitting on the throne.
Please, Jenna. At least stay out of the taverns.
I grew up in a tavern, Jenna said, and I learn a lot spending time in taverns, information that can help save lives.
Why is that your job, girl?
The work I do is important, and I'm better at it than anyone else in town, least since Bowman got blown up. I'm not going to huddle in a garret while others do my fighting for me.
If you can't stay hidden, maybe you should leave Delphi for a while, her father said. I have friends in Tamron Seat. At least I think they're still there. I don't want you going through this inspection, whatever it's for.
You read the notice. The city gates are locked until the inspections are over. Anyone who wants to leave has to get approval. And the storms have started, and they say there are wolves already running outside of the town.
What she really meant was, I'm not going to run away. She remembered what she'd said to Riley 4 years ago. We are chosen, you and I, and we're destined for great things. We'll write our own story, you'll see. She'd never considered that it could be a short story with a sad ending. The fact was, she didn't believe in destiny or miracles or mage marks. Not anymore.
I'll be careful, Da, she said. I'll be fine, I promise.
Her father looked at her, chewing on his lower lip.
"I have something to show you,"
he said finally. He lay on the floor next to her bed and pulled out a small chest that was underneath. It had always been there, as long as Jenna could remember, and it was always kept locked. But this time he drew a key out of his pocket and unlocked it. He opened it and lifted out a bundle wrapped in many layers of cloth. He unwound the cloth and spread the contents on the bed. Jenna's hand went first to the dagger. It caught her eye, as shiny things always did. Its hilt was twin dragons twined together and layered with red stones, rubies and garnets, she guessed, though she'd never seen real ones up close. With her free hand, she reached for the mage mark under her hair, brushing her fingers over the stone that centered it. The mage mark hummed with power.
"Yes," her father said. "The stones are the same."
When she withdrew it from its sheath, the blade was bright and razor-sharp, as if it had not lain under her bed for more than a decade. And along the blade, runes glowed red against bluish steel, letters in a language she didn't know. There was a fitted leather breastplate, also covered in runes, and clearly made to fit a woman, and a pair of finely made leather gloves, not the kind meant to keep your hands warm, the kind that ladies wore to go riding. She pulled them on, and they fit perfectly, extending partway up her arms. She extended her hands, admiring them, then pulled the gloves off and laid them back on the bed. Not very practical for a coal miner in Delphi. Finally, there was a broken pendant on a chain, a fragment of an instrument that reminded her of a spoked wheel, but not quite. It looked to be made of gold, likely brass, with markings all along the edge and a kind of spinner anchored at the center. It tingled a bit in her palm, meaning it was flashcraft. When Jenna looked up at her father, he said,
"That's part of a mariner's astrolabe, or made to look like one at least."
He took it from her and slipped the chain over her head so that it rested just below her collarbone.
"It may help you find your way."
Not if it's broken, she thought. Where did all this come from?
"Your grandmother left it for you. The pendant was your birth father's. I don't know about the dagger and the rest. Maybe it was your birth mother's."
Jenna stroked the leather armor again. People said that northern women rode into battle, shrieking like banshees. Was she a warrior?
"I don't know,"
her father said with a wistful smile.
"A warrior. I suppose that suits you, in a way."
No, Jenna thought. I'm the kind of warrior who slips down alleys and hides in the dark places, not the kind who rides into battle. Jenna scooped up the dagger again, turning it this way and that so it caught the light. Her mother's. It felt strangely balanced, like it belonged in her hand. She struck a pose, like she'd seen young mudback officers do with their swords. Of course, this wasn't a sword. This was a weapon that was meant to be hidden and used on the sly. Maybe it suited her after all. She quickly pushed it back into its sheath. There was no point in falling in love with a thing that could put food on the table and a roof over their heads.
"You should have sold this," she said. "We could have gone anywhere. We still can. You won't have to worry about leaving the tavern behind. We can start over, somewhere else, and build a finer place than this. On the ocean, maybe."
The ocean called to her, even though she'd only seen it in stories.
"No, it's your legacy, and I'll not sell it. I should have given it to you long before now. I know how you love beautiful things, and you've had little enough beauty in your life. Keep it with you, and maybe it will somehow keep you safe if they—"
He shook his head, blotting at his eyes with the back of his hand.
"I don't know what else to do."
Jenna allowed herself to be persuaded. She hung the dagger on a hook on the wall next to her clothes. When she reached up to adjust her collar, her fingers lingered on the mage mark. She traced it, a hot spiderweb of metal centered by cool stone. As much as she tried to dismiss it, there was a weight and importance to it. She had to resist the urge to touch it whenever her mind wandered. With some effort, Jenna pulled her hand away.
I don't care what my grandmother said. There couldn't be anything powerful about me. Nothing someone would hunt me down for anyway. How do you know? Because if there were, the King of Arden would be dead.
17. The King Goes A-Hunting. Ash pivoted in the center of the arena, cueing the king's roan to shift from a walk to a trot. His paces were smooth, unbroken, with no sign that he was favoring his front leg. Ash had him on a lunge line and a halter, not the best means of control for a high-spirited horse, but Crusher was fast becoming the best-mannered horse in the barn, at least when Ash was handling him. When he called, "Whoa!" the gelding trotted over and lowered his head for a scratch, snuffling into his hand. "Good job," Ash murmured. "Don't get too comfortable. I'll be back after lunch for another go." That had become their routine, an hour-long workout on a lunge line in the mornings and afternoons.
I can't believe what you've done with that horse. It's like you put a spell on him.
Ash turned, startled. It was Bellamy.
Nothing to do with spellcraft, Ash said. He's not in pain anymore, and that makes all the difference. Maybe so, but he's still unpredictable around anyone else. He's got a lot of bad habits to unlearn, Ash said. I'll work on that. Nobody should be riding him now anyway, and he needs to stay on soft ground. Another couple of weeks, we can begin putting him under saddle. Raleigh can take over lunging him, once I've given him some pointers.
Raleigh was one of the grooms, the best of the lot in Ash's opinion.
And here I thought I was the one in charge,
Bellamy said wryly. He held up his hand when Ash opened his mouth to apologize.
Never mind. Skill and talent give a man a certain authority. Now, there's a mare in the army livery I'd like you to take a look at.
After just a few weeks with Bellamy, Ash's role had changed from that of farrier to that of consulting healer to the royal stables, the army paddocks, and the kennels. He might prefer to be working in the healing halls instead of the stables, but there was plenty of work to do here. Still, he hadn't really come here to find a job. He was no nearer to his goal of killing the King of Arden than when he'd arrived, and he saw no likelihood that would change. He was getting to know grooms, stable hands, and servants of all kinds, but he'd not laid eyes on any member of the royal family since his arrival. Apparently, His Majesty didn't spend much time in the barn. Somehow, Ash needed to work his way into the palace itself. Patience, he told himself. You knew that it was going to take time. He just wasn't sure how much time he had. For all he knew, an attack on his mother and sister was already in the works. When Ash returned to work Crusher in late afternoon, his stall was empty. Perplexed, Ash looked down the row, wondering who had moved him and why. The other box stalls were empty too. That's when he heard a commotion out in the courtyard, shouts and curses, the snap of a whip, and a horse's scream. Rowley burst into the barn, a whip in one hand, his face ghostly pale.
Adam, come quick, it's the roan. I tried to tell him he wasn't fit to be rid, but he wouldn't listen.
Ash bolted from the stable, nearly colliding with a group of blue-bloods in hunting attire, who huddled to one side, gripping the reins of their horses, while a groom struggled to control a pack of leashed mastiffs. And beyond them was Crusher, ears flat, eyes rolling, bucking and crow-hopping, doing his best to fling his rider off his back. Meanwhile, Marshal Bellamy was trying to move in close enough to grab hold of the gelding's reins without being trampled in the process. The rider was skilled, to have kept his seat for that long, but just as Ash arrived, the gelding slammed against a stone wall and finally succeeded in dislodging him. The man fell, rolling, trying to evade the horse's flying hooves. Ash's first instinct was to let Crusher trample the fool, But Bellamy was moving in again, stepping between the horse and the fallen rider, desperately trying to drive the gelding back far enough so that the rider could scramble away. Fearing the horse marshal would be trampled instead, Ash came in from the side, managed to snag one of the reins, and pulled the gelding's head around so he circled away from the other two. He managed to get a hand on Crusher's withers and pushed soothing magic into him. He kept on turning the horse in a tight circle, repeating "whoa," until the plunging stopped and the ears came forward, and Crusher stood still, shaking and blowing hard, on 3 legs. Blood was running down the 4th leg, not the one with the abscessed hoof. Ash didn't need a close look to tell that the cannon bone was shattered just above the fetlock, the bone poking through the skin. That sometimes happened when a lame horse put too much pressure on his 3 healthy legs. Ash pressed his fingers between the gelding's eyes, trying to help him with the pain, but it nearly knocked him on his ass. Bellamy walked toward him.
"You all right, Adam?"
Ash shook his head, pointed wordlessly at the broken leg, and Bellamy's face went gray.
"Scummer,"
the marshal muttered and looked away. The rider was on his feet now, brushing himself off, straightening his sleeves. He wore a fine hunting coat, embroidered with red hawks, now besmirched with dirt. A long cut across his cheek oozed blood, and his sandy hair was disheveled. The rest of the hunting party clustered around him, chattering like sparrows. "Your Majesty, are you injured? Shall we call Master Merrill? Thank the Maker you weren't killed." Your Majesty. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, while Ash's heart accelerated, thumping painfully in his chest. He watched wordlessly as the King of Arden shook off his courtiers, grabbed Raleigh by the front of his barn coat and yanked him close.
"Imbecile! I thought you said that Beast was improving. He's worse than before."
He gave Raleigh a shake. "Your Majesty," Raleigh croaked, teeth chattering. "I'm sorry." With that, King Gerard backhanded Raleigh across the face, sending him staggering. A red mist collected before Ash's eyes. This was the man who'd tried to bully his mother into marrying him, who'd been responsible for the murder of his sister and his father, who'd tried to murder him and would do so again in a heartbeat. This was the monster to blame for so many losses. The world would be a better place without him. Taking hold of his amulet, Ash took a step toward the king, but Bellamy stepped in front of him, gripping his shoulders and glaring into his eyes.
"Don't lose your head, Adam."
"Get out of my way."
"No,"
the horse marshal said.
"It won't do poor Crusher any good, and you'll likely get us all killed. I'm the one that hired you, remember?" "It's worth it,"
Ash growled, trying to push past him, but Bellamy gripped his arm and held on.
"Not to me and Raleigh it isn't," Bellamy said. "And not to you either, because you won't touch him. Not with Majory. He's got a charm against it or something."
"A charm against Majory?" Ash looked past Bellamy to the king, once again surrounded by his anxious crew.
"Are you talking about a talisman, or—" "I wouldn't know about such things." Bellamy made the sign of Malthus. "If you just have to give it a go, do it somewhere other than my barn."
The marshal turned toward the king.
"I'm sorry about what happened, Your Majesty," he said. "Raleigh here was right. The gelding was improving. I don't know what got into him today. Now we'll have to put him down, I'm afraid."
The king slapped his riding gloves across his palm.
"Do it," he said. "The beast is a devil."
He turned and walked away without a backward glance. And with him, Ash's first chance at making good on his promise. Ash watched him go. Was he being smart, strategic, level-headed? Or was he simply a coward? 18. Lady of Grace. Destin Carn was in a good mood. For the first time since arriving in Delphi, he felt he was making some measurable progress on the hunt for the rune-marked girl. Even if he never found her, he could at least prove he'd been thorough in the attempt. Not that any kind of failure would play well in Arden's court. He'd just supervised the barbering of 100 women coming off the day shift in the mines. Miners had been especially hard to reach, since it seemed that they were always either working or sleeping. So he'd set up a hygiene station at the army camp on the road to the mines, so it wouldn't take them far out of their way. Over several weeks, Destin had streamlined the hair-cutting process and hand-picked his barbers, choosing the least brutal and the most skillful of Claremont's blackbirds. Each woman treated was fitted with a pair of silver earrings to signify that she had been examined. He'd wrung the silver for the jewelry from the Lord Mayor, who was as corrupt as they come. He hoped that by making the process as painless as possible, citizens would be encouraged to cooperate. The sooner he got it done, the closer he might be to getting out of Delphi. He only wished he could get Shed of Claremont, who insisted on helping. In fact, the captain of the guard was sticking to him tight as a horse-tick. Destin and his blackbird Shadow rode through a blinding snowstorm all the way to town, the sound of their horses' hooves muffled by the thickening blanket. When they finally reached the city gates, they had to hail the guards to be admitted, the result of Destin's order. As they entered the city, Destin realized he was tired of the mug and mutton, over-familiar with all of its marginal fare, and weary of the serving girls who scattered at their approach. Maybe it would be worth visiting one of the smaller inns, a place they hadn't quartered in. The food might be better, or at least different. He'd heard good reports about the Lady of Grace in the quiet North End, so he decided to give it a try. Claremont, of course, tagged along. A painting of a beautiful noblewoman decorated the sign outside. The entrance opened into a large front room with a fireplace at one end and a heating stove at the other. The common room was full. Destin hoped that boded well for the food. Before he chose a table, he walked the length of the room and stuck his head into a smaller room at the back. It had a fireplace also, and tables for playing nix and bones. Destin and Claremont settled themselves in the corner of the main room and ordered up mugs of ale and meat pies. When the pies came, they were enclosed in a tender, flaky crust, fat with meat and vegetables. Destin focused on his food until the edge was off his hunger, and then he once again began to take an interest in his surroundings. The crowd in the Lady of Grace was more genteel than that which frequented the Mug and Mutton. For one thing, there were women among the customers as well as the help. There were merchants and tradesmen, and travelers complaining about the locking of the gates. A few off-duty officers from the regular army shared a large table at the back. As usual, people kept their distance from Destin and Claremont, but it was less obvious than in the rough-and-tumble atmosphere of the Mug and Mutton. Some kind of entertainment was going on in the far corner. A crowd had gathered around a table, some standing, some sitting, including soldiers, guardsmen, and travelers. Although Destin couldn't see above the heads of those who were standing, they were all staring down intently, and now and then they broke into laughter, sometimes elbowing each other as if to say, "Good one." Could be a storyteller, Destin thought, though it was difficult to fathom why a traveling tale-spinner would visit Delphi this time of the year. The weather and the tips were better farther south. The party in the corner went on while Destin finished his meat pie and ordered up another mug of ale. Finally, it seemed the show was over. Some people drifted away, reclaiming their own tables again. He could just make out somebody sitting against the wall, and then some more patrons gathered around, blocking his view again. When his server brought his ale, he asked her what was going on.
"It's a fortune-teller. He reads the cards for people, moves from inn to inn. People seem to like him. Calls himself Lyle Truth-Teller." She grinned. "Oft-times he tells too much truth, as some were found. But he always draws a crowd." Destin was mildly curious. When it came to entertainment, a fortune-teller was rarer than a tale-spinner or a musician. True, most of them were frauds, experts at learning a little bit about a person so they could spit it back. Anyone who could truly predict the future wouldn't while his time away in a tavern. Still, they could be amusing,
and he had time to kill before the night shift let out at the mines. When the server returned with Claremont's ale, Destin put a hand on her arm.
"Ask Truth-Teller to join us."
He nodded toward the crowd in the corner.
"We wish to talk with him."
She threw a doubtful glance toward where the fortune-teller held court, and a worried look at Destin.
"I'll see what I can do, sir," she said.
When she returned, her face was pale and her eyes large.
"He says thank you, but he's more comfortable where he is, sir,"
she added, as if mimicking the way the fortune-teller had tacked it on as an afterthought. Destin straightened, surprised. Most entertainers would jump at the chance to impress someone close to the king, or would be afraid to refuse in any case.
"Did you tell him who I am?"
He turned the mug in his hands.
"I did, sir,"
the server said, licking her lips.
"Maybe the spell is on him. I'm not sure I was getting through, if you know what I mean. I wouldn't take it the wrong way, sir, if I were you."
Claremont gripped the server by the wrist so that she cried out in pain. He jerked her close so they were eye to eye and said,
"You tell that insolent whey-faced tavern rat to let her go, Claremont."
Destin growled, his good mood quickly dissipating.
"It's not her fault, and it's not that important."
Claremont's eyes narrowed in annoyance. He released the server and she hurried away, rubbing her wrist. Then he leaned across the table.
"You're new here, Lieutenant, and you don't know how things work. The thing is, you can't let these Delphian curs think they can get away with—"
Slamming his tankard down, Destin reached across the table and gripped Claremont's wrist. The captain's eyes went wide, and he howled in pain, struggling to pull away. All around them, the other patrons focused on their meals, pretending not to hear. Destin leaned in close to the captain.
"I'm only going to tell you this once, so I suggest that you listen. I'd like to have a drink in a tavern where the help isn't scared to get near me. I think I'll learn a lot more that way. I don't need you to second-guess my decisions. Keep it up, and I might forget that, technically, you outrank me."
Then he let go. Claremont looked down at his charred and blistered wrist, then back up at Destin.
You're...
"Yes," Destin said.
"I am. Now shut up and stay here."
He rose, picked up his ale, and crossed the room to the fortune-teller's table. He didn't look back to see what Claremont did or did not do. The fortune-teller's clients were a polished young man wearing a fine silk surcoat with a ruffled collar and a handsome older woman in a well-cut traveling suit. Destin might have thought they were mother and son, except that they were holding hands and smiling at each other like newlyweds or lovers. They did not notice Destin's approach because they were facing the corner where the truth-teller sat. Destin stood just behind the pair so that he had an excellent view of the proceedings. The other spectators took one look at Destin and gradually slipped away, finding things to do in other parts of the tavern. The seer was a young man, hardly more than a boy, medium tall with delicate features, dressed in an odd assortment of clothing. He wore a tunic that hung loosely on his spare frame, a surcoat that must have been fine at one time, but now was threadbare and frayed at the edges. The sleeves hung to his fingertips, and bits of tired lace peeked out at the wrist and collar. On his head he wore a large, flat velvet cap of an old-fashioned style, as if he were the scion of an old money family that had fallen on hard times. If the truth-teller saw Destin approach, he gave no sign of it. He was shuffling cards, and they flashed so quickly under his long fingers that they seemed to appear and disappear. He had the woman cut them and cut them again. Then he pulled cards from the deck and turned them over, slapping them down on the table in rows. Destin could see that they were not regular playing cards, though they shared some of the same symbols. The boy looked them over, then lifted his gaze to the lady. His eyes were distinctive, a stunning golden color, like a cat's or a raptor's. Destin wondered how he did that, if he used some kind of potion or treatment to get them to look that way. However he achieved it, it certainly gave him an otherworldly look.
"I see a long journey,"
the boy said. He did look tranced, and his voice had a whispery, mysterious quality, giving the impression that he drew his knowledge from some sacred well within, and not from the cards.
"Well done," the woman said, smiling. "Garin and I have come all the way from Havensgate this morning." She seemed terribly excited to find out something she already knew.
I could do that well, Destin thought, noting the dust layered on the hem of the lady's skirt, the mud splattered on the gentleman's boots. Garin apparently agreed, because he made a skeptical face and touched his companion's elbow.
"Let's go upstairs, Catherine. We need to make an early start in the morning."
"Just a few more minutes, darling," Catherine said. "I want to hear what Elsie has to say."
The boy picked up another card. This time he looked directly at Garin.
"You will lose a great deal of money."
The young man rolled his eyes. "Oh, really?" he said. "How horrifying. When exactly will this happen?" Lyle Truthsteller smiled mysteriously.
"Soon. Very soon."
"Will I be robbed? Will I have bad luck betting on the horses?"
The young man gulped down his drink and signaled for another. Truthsteller turned another card, ran his finger over its surface, and looked up at Catherine.
"You are being deceived by someone close to you," he said.
"Really?"
Catherine glanced at Garin.
"Can you tell me who it is?"
"The cards tell us what they will tell us, but not always everything we need to know."
Another easy guess, Destin thought. In his experience, family and friends are always the first to stick a knife in your back. Garin seemed a little rattled, though. He shifted in his seat and looked toward the stairs again. Truthsteller fixed Garin with a penetrating gaze.
"I see a letter addressed to you from Angelique."
Garin turned white as the snow that was falling outside.
What do you mean? I don't know any Angelique."
Catherine stared at him in surprise.
"Why, Garin, of course you know Angelique, the clerk in my shop in Whitehall."
Garin planted both hands on the table and pushed to his feet.
"Let's go. This is a waste of time." "It says—"
The seer frowned, as if trying to make out a hazy script.
"It says, I'm not going to sleep with you any more, you faithless bastard."
The young man shook his head, his mouth forming a no, though no sound came out. Catherine was looking alert and interested now.
"Excuse me, what's that again?"
"I think I've caught something from you, Garin,"
the boy went on, eyes half closed.
"I'm itching where I never itched before. If you're looking for that silk dressing gown, the one with the dragons—" "Dragons?"
Catherine looked from Garin to Truthsteller, startled recognition on her face.
"You left it here, but don't come looking for it, because I threw it in the dust bun."
Truthsteller squinted.
"I guess that's dust bin. If you think you can come back here any time you please and wrap your legs around my—" "Enough!"
Garin roared, as if trying to drown out the Truthsteller.
"Don't listen to this scummer-tongued devil."
He stumbled a bit over scummer-tongued.
"Come, Catherine."
He stalked toward the stairs, looking back over his shoulder once to see if the lady was following. She wasn't. She sat staring thoughtfully at Truthsteller, who sat relaxed, expressionless, his arms circling the cards on the table as if protecting them. Catherine stirred then, seeming to shake off a bit of disappointment. She reached into her handbag, drew out a small pouch, and tossed it onto the table without counting the contents. It clanked as it landed heavily. She didn't look happy, but rather like someone who has had a narrow escape.
"Thank you, truth-teller," she said slowly. "I think you have saved me a great deal of grief."
She rose from her chair with great dignity and walked away, back straight toward the stairs. The boy swept the cards together and shuffled them again, staring straight out in front of him. The pouch had disappeared. Destin sat down in the chair Garen had vacated. All of Destin's skepticism had disappeared in the face of the seer's performance. All he had left was a crowd of questions.
"How did you do that?"
he demanded. The boy turned his eyes to him. He flinched back a bit, as if startled. Collecting himself, he said,
"Foreseeing is an art, not a science. Sometimes you get nothing, and sometimes you get a very clear picture."
By now the cards had disappeared into the sleeve of his jacket, and then the boy was standing.
"By your leave, my lord."
He bowed deeply and made to turn away.
"Wait,"
Destin commanded.
"Sit a while. I want to know more about this foreseeing."
The boy shook his head.
"I'm sorry, my lord. It is past my time. I need to get some sleep. I work the mines, and we start early."
He smiled apologetically. He really did look dead on his feet, drained in a way.
"You have the day off tomorrow," Destin said evenly. "On my authority. Now sit."
Reaching, he gripped the boy about the wrist, careful this time not to grip too hard, or allow any flash to penetrate. The bones were delicate under his fingers, the kind that might be easily broken. Lyle sank back down into his chair. All traces of the trance were gone, and his face had gone pale, as if he suddenly realized his peril.
"Please, my lord," he whispered, "I meant no harm. Just entertainment, to draw the people, earn a little extra money. I will return the lady's purse if you like."
Destin kept hold of the boy's arm, studying him. Lyle Truth-Teller wore no tell-tale glow of magic, and he could feel no seepage of it through his skin.
"I think she got her money's worth, though not everyone would reward that kind of news."
"Yes, well—"
Lyle's gaze dropped to the tabletop, and it was as if the lights were dimmed.
"That happens. These days it is not uncommon to be punished for telling the truth."
"Is the magic in the cards?"
Destin leaned forward slightly.
"Or in you?"
Lyle didn't look up, but shook his head.
"Magic, my lord. I want nothing to do with that. The fathers say that mages are idolaters and devils."
Then the boy looked up at him and colored.
"I meant no offense to you, sir.
Why would I be offended?"
Destin's voice came quiet.
"Do you take me for a mage?"
Now Lyle was trembling.
"I'm sorry, sir. It was presumptuous of me. I misspoke. You looked like a mage, that's all."
So the boy was not a mage, but he could spot one. Strange. Was that part of his gift, along with truth-telling? Destin's natural curiosity was piqued. Could this boy be of some help in finding the mage-marked girl?
"Lieutenant."
A stocky man with a snow-white apron stood at tableside. A ring of keys at his belt signified that he was the innkeeper. His face was heavily lined with age, and his hair had gone white, but he looked sturdy and deep-rooted, like an old tree.
"Is this boy annoying you?"
He was looking at Destin's hand fastened about Lyle's wrist. Destin released his grip and sat back.
"No, innkeeper, not really. I'd like my fortune read is all. Can we use the back room?"
The innkeeper stiffened, looking from the truth-teller to Destin.
"I run an honest house here, my lord, and I look after the help. I won't countenance anyone taking advantage of this boy."
Destin raised both hands. "I want my fortune read, that's all, in private." Would you countenance that?" The innkeeper studied him a moment, as if to be sure, then nodded as if resigned.
"The back room is free,"
he said, and returned to the bar. Lyle spoke up then.
"Please, sir, I don't think that's such a good idea."
"Why not?" Destin put on his friendliest look, which Lyle didn't see because he was looking down at the table. "Tell my fortune, and I'll buy you dinner."
I don't trade the truth for dinner, only for money. And it's dangerous for someone like me to read the cards for someone like yourself."
Destin reached out and lifted the boy's chin until he had to look him in the eye. "And why is that?" A few freckles stood out against the boy's pallor. He shifted in his chair, ran his tongue over colorless lips.
You may not like what I have to say. I may be wrong, and you might not like that. Or I may be right, and you might not like that either."
His voice faltered.
"I don't want to bet my life on figuring out what you want to hear."
And then he covered his mouth as if to take back the words.
"I'm sorry, sir,"
he said in his whispery voice.
"I don't always think before I speak."
Destin smiled. "Let's cut to it. I'm not so much interested in my future as interested in you. I'll just ask you a few questions, and you can be on your way. How does that sound?" From the expression on Lyle's face, it didn't sound good at all, but he gave a quick nod and said,
"As you wish, my lord."
Destin followed the truth-teller into the back room, shutting the door behind them. He motioned to a table by the fire, one with 2 chairs drawn up. Destin sat with his back to the hearth, and the boy sat opposite him, watching him warily, the firelight exposing the planes and angles of his face. "So," Destin said, "let's begin." Without waiting for an answer, he reached across the table and seized both of Lyle's hands, careful not to let any flash penetrate his skin. If the boy's a mage, I can't sense it in him, Destin thought, and usually there's something. Now Destin released the magic into him, let it flow as if to fill him up, then reached through it to find the boy's mind. And couldn't. He tried again, and it was like searching an empty room. It was odd, this feeling that the power was flooding into a void, an empty place, not accumulating, but dissipating somehow. Channeling through. He'd tried to charm trained mages in the past, but that was different. In that case, he'd run right into a barrier, a shield that prevented entry altogether. Yet when he looked into the boy's eyes, there was a vacancy there, and his face had relaxed and his breathing slowed. The boy looked spelled. He must be. Most people never even knew they'd been had. "Lyle?" he said softly, experimentally.
"Yes, sir."
His eyes were half closed, and his head lolled a bit. "Lyle, what is your real name?"
"Lyle Talbot, sir."
"Not truth-teller?"
"No, sir."
"How long have you been reading the cards?"
"A year, sir."
"I'm looking for something, Lyle. Do you know what it is?"
"Yes, sir."
"What is it?"
"A girl."
"And how do you know that, Lyle?"
"Because you're bringing all the women in and looking at them. There's something you're looking for. It's not plague, sir."
"Do you know where the girl is?"
"No, sir."
"Will we find what we're looking for?" Lyle frowned.
"I don't know, sir."
"Is there magic in you, Lyle?" Long pause.
"No, sir."
"Is there magic in the cards?" Another long pause.
"No, sir. But people like to think so."
Destin blew out his breath, exasperated. "How did you do what you did with Garin and his girlfriend?" Lyle shifted uncomfortably. His hands became slippery with perspiration.
I talked to them before, and they agreed to act it out. Sometimes rich people think it's fun to play act. I did it for the crowd. It brings in business. I didn't think you would come and listen.
So it was an act, truth-teller. Destin's voice was harsh with disappointment.
Yes, sir. I'm an entertainer. I don't mean any harm.
Had he really hoped this boy had the gift? Was he really so eager to hear the truth? Destin sat silent for a moment. "What's my mother's given name, Lyle?" he asked softly.
I don't know, sir.
The boy shook his head quickly, too quickly. "What's your mother's name?" Destin snapped.
My mother,
the boy said, seeming flummoxed somehow.
It's Frances. Frances was her name.
"What do you see when you look at me, boy?"
I don't know.
Destin tightened his grip, twisting until Lyle's face went sheet white, and he cried out in pain.
What do you see? I see a ship, my lord. You were climbing in the rigging, and a beach, and you were walking on the beach, holding hands with...
"That's enough!" Destin all but shouted. He stopped the flow of power and released Lyle's hands. The boy sat, eyes closed, trembling. Destin regarded him thoughtfully, rubbing his chin, turning over what he'd learned.
Sir, did you want to ask me something else? Did I answer any questions?
Lyle seemed agitated, upset, as if afraid he'd made a fatal mistake. "You did fine, truth-teller. I am satisfied. Go back to your patrons." Lyle sat for a moment, staring at Destin, looking as if he wanted to say something else. "I said get out!" The fortune-teller rose and half stumbled from the room. Destin watched him go, drumming his fingers on the table. I spelled him, so he should have been telling the truth. Yet he lied, with bits of truth mingled in. The truth-teller claimed he didn't know Destin's mother's name, but when asked what his own mother's name was, he'd stumbled and said Frances. Destin's mother's name had been Frances. He debated. The boy was frightened as it was, and he did respond to pain. He could bring him back in and lock the door, and it wouldn't take much persuasion to get the truth out of him, if there was more to know. I see a ship and a beach. A cold rivulet of fear trickled down Destin's spine. He had his own secrets after all, and there was no telling what the truth-teller would reveal if pressed. There were some truths Destin didn't want told. He didn't want to have to kill the boy. The boy wasn't going anywhere, so he had plenty of time to make a decision before he returned to Arden's court. Maybe he'd just leave the boy be, let him keep whatever secrets he was holding close. So, should he go back to the mug and mutton? No. He preferred the Lady of Grace for a variety of reasons, including this private room in the back. When he returned to the main room, it was still crowded, but Lyle Truth-teller was nowhere to be seen. Destin found the innkeeper clearing off some tables. He looked up and flinched when he saw Destin.
"Did the boy read your fortune, my lord? Were you satisfied?"
"I was," Destin said. "He's very impressive. What can you tell me about him?" The innkeeper set a tray of glasses on the bar, turned and faced him. "He works all the inns around here, and he always draws a crowd. He has a rude tongue in his head, though, and some think he crosses the line. If you're concerned, my lord, I won't have him back. On the contrary, I believe the boy has a gift. I hope you'll keep him on here. In fact, I insist." Destin made it clear that this was an order and not a request. The innkeeper nodded, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "If that's your wish, my lord, I'll see it done."
What is your name, innkeeper? Will Hamlet, at your service. Will, I'll be moving in here tomorrow. I'll want one of your best rooms, with a door that locks, and board as well. I'm sorry, Lieutenant, Will Hamlet said, licking his lips. We're full at present. Then kick someone out, Destin said. I'll also be needing the use of your back room for a few weeks anyway. The back room? What for? Destin forgave the question, since he could tell the innkeeper was terminally nervous. I intend to cut some hair.
19. Fire in the Hole. It was late, so late that the last of the resident stable boys had already burrowed into the straw to sleep. Ash had assisted with a breech foaling of a mare down at the military barns, and that had put him behind. It had been a week since he'd put the king's gelding down. He'd insisted on doing it himself, by using magic to stop the blood as it rushed through the great artery in his neck. It was a painless death, as far as he could tell, but that didn't make it any easier. It was a horse, but that didn't make it less important. It was one more piece of evidence that there was no place to hide in all of the 7 realms where the evil at the top of the Ardenine Empire didn't percolate down. Ash might try to turn into somebody else, Ash Hansen or Adam Freeman, but the King of Arden would not. He wouldn't stop killing until he'd extinguished the Grey Wolf line. Ash wished he had let Crusher kill the bastard, and he would have if he'd known who the rider was, and if it hadn't meant risking Bellamy. He couldn't afford to let those kinds of opportunities go by. Options? He could poison the river, but it was a stinking sewer already. Nobody drew water from the river, unless they had no other choice. He might get at the cisterns and wells in the palace, but too many people would die, and still there was no guarantee he'd hit his target. He'd tried to get in to see Meryl in the healing halls again, and had been turned away. He'd applied for a job in the kitchens, but in a way he was a victim of his own success. Marshal Bellamy refused to allow a transfer. Someone else might lie in wait on the rooftops with a bow, but Ash was not that good an archer. He was used to working close. He'd be willing to give his life in a successful attempt, but the last thing he wanted was to hand King Gerard the kill he'd missed at Odin's Ford. Ash walked out into the yard for a breath of air before finding his bed. It was nearly solstice, but the oppressive southern heat had scarcely abated. He found himself yearning for the breathless cold of the mountains, where life and death balanced on a knife's edge. Was it snowing at home? Would his mother and sister take the sleigh out on their own? The stable yard was deserted except for Haman, the night baker, who sat on the edge of the well, drinking from the flask he carried with him everywhere. Haman was just starting his shift. He'd be proofing the bread for breakfast in the middle of the night, so it would be ready for baking in just a few hours. Ash had exchanged just a few words with Haman, but he felt a kinship with him just the same. They were both solitary individuals, content to work alone. That's when he saw a slight figure emerge from the keep and cross the yard, heading straight for the stables. When he got closer, Ash realized that it was a boy, maybe 10 years old, clad in rough breeches and tunic. He wore a rough jute belt at his waist and sandals on his feet. Ash knew work coming when he saw it, and he thought of fading back into the shadows before he was spotted, but it was already too late.
"You there," the boy said. "Where can I find Marshal Bellamy's healer?"
"That would be me," Ash said, wishing he could deny it.
"You,"
the boy said, looking him up and down with avid curiosity.
"What's your name, then?"
"Adam Freeman." The boy nodded.
"You're the one I'm looking for. I'm Sam, and I work in the kennels. The kennel master sent me here to fetch you. Can't it wait until morning? I was just going to clean up and get some dinner."
Sam shrugged his shoulders.
Suit yourself, but if Her Majesty's favorite dog dies before morning, it'll be your fault, not mine. Her Majesty's dog?
Ash looked down at his heavy canvas breeches, muck-stained from the stables, and his shirt covered in bits of straw and horsehair.
If it's that bad, I'll come, but I'll need to clean up before— The dog don't care how you look, the boy said. If you're going to come, you need to come now. I want to get my own dinner and go on to bed.
Maybe the dog won't care how I look, but he might have an opinion on how I smell.
All right, Ash said. Let me get my bag.
When they exited the stable, Ash expected to circle around behind the stables to the royal kennels. But instead, Sam led him straight across the paved courtyard to a side door of the palace.
We're going into the palace? Ash said, again brushing at his clothes. I thought we were going to the kennels. Her Majesty's dog don't live in the kennels, the boy said, rolling his eyes. Nobody's going to see us, if that's what you're worried about. We'll go the back way.
His misgivings growing, Ash followed the kennel boy up and down stairs, through twists and turns where the palace had been added onto. As they hurried down the walkway next to the kitchen, he felt the searing heat from the ovens. Haman must be in there, getting ready to begin the baking for the next day. Though Ash tried to keep track of the turns they made, before long he was hopelessly lost. Sam was true to his word, leading him through back hallways and not the main corridors. Eventually, they descended to the cellar level. That was plain enough, dank and dark and significantly cooler, lined with roughly hewn stones. It was like walking a maze, up and down narrow passages, around barricades and through storage rooms.
Where exactly are we going? Ash asked, sorry he'd agreed to come. Don't tell me the Queen keeps her dog in the cellar. You said you didn't want anybody to see you, right? Sam said, circling around a puddle on the floor. This goes under the courtyard and comes out by the Queen's apartments. It's a shortcut.
The Queen's apartments? Ash's heart quickened. Was there any chance the king would be there? The air was musty and carried the scent of standing water and old stone. The only light came from torches set into the walls at intervals, but those were few and far between. After being so chatty at first, Sam said little except to offer direction now and then. He seemed a little nervous himself, crying out when a rat skittered along the wall, jumping at every little rustling in the dark. Once Ash touched his shoulder and he flinched away like he'd been burned and made the sign of Malthus. Before long, Ash was jittery too. He pressed his arm against his side, verifying that his shiv was still in place, and gripped his amulet, feeding it power. They ended up in a warren of storerooms filled with barrels and casks and sacks piled almost to the low ceiling. There were rows of barrels of the lubricant used to grease wagon axles and carriage wheels, food supplies and kegs of kerosene for the stoves as well. Sam led the way through the storeroom toward a door at the far end.
I think you're lost, Ash said finally, as they passed a narrow staircase. I'm not lost, Sam said stubbornly. It's just up here a little ways. Don't worry, Ash said. Let's just go back to the main floor and ask someone. No, look, I got a map, Sam said, fumbling with a pouch tied to his belt. If you have a map, then why haven't you looked at it? Ash said irritably. Why indeed? Sam turned and swept his hand up toward him, but Ash was already throwing himself backward, out of danger. Something shimmered in the air, but most of the glittery powder that was meant to hit him full in the face flew past his shoulder. When the trailing edge of it caught him in the face and in the eyes, it was as if someone had taken a torch to him. He screamed and stumbled backward, scrubbing at his face with both hands until his hands were stinging too. He was nauseous and dizzy and disoriented, his eyes streaming with tears. When he opened them, it was like looking into a dense black fog. He could see nothing at all. I did it, Father, Sam shouted. I threw it in his face, just like you said. Now give me my money, and I'll go. I don't need to see any demon killing."
Ash heard the door at the end of the corridor open and close, the sound of fabric swishing over stone, a muffled cry, cut off, and the sound of a body hitting the floor. "Oh, Sam," Ash thought, "you mistook unholy for holy." He reached out his hands to steady himself and could feel the soft splintered wood of the doors along the hallway on either side.
"So, mage, I have taken your eyes," a soft voice said. "We'll see how well you do when I hunt you in the dark."
The powder was in Ash's mouth. His tongue and throat burned, and he was choking, his airway constricted so he could scarcely get his breath. He could feel the tears running down his face, but he could see nothing. Ash kept moving backward, because he could hear the man advancing, his sandals slapping somewhere out in front of him.
What is it? What have you done to me?" "Lord Darien's stone," the voice replied out of the darkness. "Ground fine."
The same as the assassins had used in Odin's Ford, the stuff that snuffed out magic. That meant this man must be another of the Darien Blademen. Ash shuffled backward as he desperately tried to think of a plan.
"I'm going to cut your throat, mage,"
the Darien said softly, conversationally, in case Ash had any doubt as to his intent.
"I'm going to cleanse you of the taint and take the sacrament."
Ash gripped his amulet, extended his other hand, and attempted to send flame roaring down the hallway toward his attacker. He had no idea if it worked or not.
"Is that the best you can do, demon?"
The voice was even closer now. Ash drew his knife. When Ash could no longer feel the walls on either side, he knew he was in the large storeroom beyond the corridor. He turned and ran, hands stretched out before him, bruising his knees and hips on casks and barrels as he cut a crooked path through the obstacle course that had been laid for him. He moved as quickly as he could, hoping to outdistance the man stalking him, at least temporarily. He knew his only chance was to find his way back to the first floor, but there were not many staircases, and if he took the time to find one, the Darien would get to him first. If the brother followed him onto the main floor, Ash's identity would be discovered for sure. He turned a corner and slid between what felt like two large barrels and sank to the floor, hoping he was out of sight.
"Do you think you can hide from me, demon? I can track you by your stench. I caught your scent a few times in the yard, but I could never find you."
The owner of the voice was coming closer.
"You murdered 5 of my brothers at Odin's Ford. Now you will feel the blade of holy Darius."
Keep talking, Ash thought. That way I'll know where you are. But then the assassin fell silent, as if he could read Ash's thoughts. Ash put his fingers in front of his face and could see nothing. His mouth, his nose, his sinuses were still burning, and he had a raging headache. Every breath he took was like a flame inside his chest. There was no way he could use his power when he couldn't even see his attacker. He would be dead before he knew the man was there. And given the effect of the Darien stone at Odin's Ford, he might not have any power left to use beyond what was already stored in his amulet. He couldn't afford to waste it. He could hear and see nothing, though he knew the man must be coming closer. He was aware of a rising panic, the smothering onslaught of the dark. His entire body tingled, every nerve screaming, awaiting the cold, intimate touch of the knife. He forced himself to breathe in and out slowly, to think. Then Ash remembered how he had detected the assassins at Odin's Ford. He couldn't see them in the dark, but he could feel their hunger. He let out a breath and tried to relax. Taking hold of his amulet, he pushed his power outward, seeking the man and his bloodlust. An image appeared in his mind, a bright figure against darkness. The priest was about 15 feet away and moving slowly in his direction, turning his head this way and that, as if to sniff the air. Ash couldn't see anything else in the room, but he could roughly place the assassin. Ash palmed his blade, though he knew he'd fare poorly as a blind man in a knife fight. He would have to hope he could muster enough power to bring the man down. As long as the brother lived, Ash could be identified. He waited until the bright shape of the man was just opposite him. The assassin would turn in a moment and see him. Gripping his amulet, Ash swept out his arm, flinging out what he hoped was a spray of flames toward the priest. The gloom before his eyes brightened briefly. There was a scream of pain, and then the sound of something heavy falling. Ash didn't wait. He scrambled to his feet again, circling to avoid treading on the man, and staggered across the storeroom. If he were indeed under the kitchen, there would be a staircase off the hallway at the far end. He heard movement again behind him, and the brother's voice returned, thick with pain and menace.
"For that, I'll kill you slowly, mage, and drink your blood many times before you die. This will be our temple for an extended ceremony."
The man was still coming after him, but moving more slowly now, as if he were injured. Ash shoved over barrels, rolling them into the path of the hunter behind. He staggered to his left, as far as he could, until he found the wall. Then he followed along it, hoping to find the way to the stairway. In his mind, he could see the shape behind him, mad with rage and need. His groping hand found a small cask, stacked atop a barrel, and he lifted it and tossed it blindly over his shoulder. It smashed on the stone floor, and something splashed against his ankles. He caught the pungent scent of kerosene. Finally, there was a vacancy under his questing hand, and he knew he'd found the doorway. He launched himself through it. The stairway should be somewhere along the corridor to the left-hand side, unless he was completely lost. Then he was a dead man. At least there were not so many obstacles in the corridor, and he moved along more quickly, trailing his hand along the wall to keep himself oriented. And then, once again, there was an opening. As he turned into it, something sang past his ear and clattered on the stone floor ahead of him. He flinched ineffectively, unsure which way to jump. His questing foot found a step. It was the staircase. He flung himself upward, half stumbling, half crawling up the stairs, afraid a misstep would send him tumbling backward. The blade man was close on his heels, his breath rasping in and out. Something slashed across his ankle, and he felt a searing pain. The Darien was trying to cut his tendon, to disable him, perhaps still hoping to prolong the kill. Ash kicked wildly, felt his foot crunch into bone, then turned and threw his knife. The priest shrieked, but Ash kept climbing, sucking down painful breaths until he crested the stairs. The darkness before his eyes seemed a little brighter, and he could feel the dry heat from the ovens. He must be in the kitchen. His hand struck a tall wooden vessel standing at the top of the stairs, with a round indented top. Another barrel. Apparently someone had brought it up the steps, but had not bothered to move it to wherever it was to be used. Ash grabbed its top, lifting and manhandling it into position. He gave it a shove and heard it bumping down the steps. The assassin screamed, and then there was the sound of the barrel exploding as it hit the stone floor at the foot of the stairs. Ash sent what he hoped were balls of wizard fire rolling down after it. He heard a whoosh, as if all the air had been sucked away around him. The heat was suddenly blistering, and he staggered away in what he prayed was the direction of the door. The door to the outside had been left open to release some of the heat of the kitchens, and the cool draft of air guided him. He crossed the threshold and felt the dirt and stones of the courtyard under his feet. The well would be ahead at the center. Although he knew he should just keep moving, should try to get as far away from his attacker as possible, he just had to wash the awful dust away and hope. He had heard of blind healers, those who used only the gift, but he didn't want to be one if he had a choice. He almost stumbled over the low wall around the well. There was always a bucket of water sitting on the ground beside it with a gourd for drinking. He groped for it with both hands. When he found it, he dropped to his knees next to it, grasped each side of the bucket, and plunged his head into the water. The water was icy cold, and there was almost immediate relief, although his eyes and face still burned. He scrubbed at his face with his hands, rinsing it again and again, opening his eyes to allow the water to sluice the burning powder away. When he lifted his head, the cold water sliding down his neck, he found that his vision was returning. He could see the shapes of the buildings that surrounded the courtyard, the bright, bloody haze around the torches in the niches along the wall. Shuddering with relief, he immersed his face once again. He felt, rather than heard, a concussion, like an earthquake under his feet, and then another. He sat back on his heels, shaking his head like a dog, flinging water everywhere, and looked back toward the palace in time to see one wall of the kitchen slowly collapse into shards of stone. In his panicked state of mind, he thought at first it was the work of the Darien priest, bent on vengeance. Then he realized what was happening. He could picture all those barrels of lubricant in the basement, the barrel he'd shattered at the foot of the stairs, the wizard fire he'd sent after the assassin. When he saw the bright flicker of flame in the kitchen windows, he knew the conflagration was of his own making. Then, incredibly, a figure appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, a dark outline against the brightness behind. It can't be, Ash thought desperately. The priest was impossible to kill. Ash found a metal rod on the ground next to the well and wrapped his fingers around it. At least now he could see who was coming after him, and he would have something to turn the knife. He charged toward the man. The man stumbled and fell on his face, his back in flames. He was wearing cook's whites, not a black robe. It was Haman, the night baker. Ash dropped the club and sprang forward. When he reached Haman, he ducked his face away from the flames and slid his hands under him, heaving him over onto his back. Haman cried out in agony, but the weight of his body smothered the fire. Ash looked up to see Raleigh standing over them, staring in mute shock.
"Bring water from the well, and hurry!"
Ash turned the baker back onto his stomach and tore away the charred strips of cloth that covered his back. Haman's flask rolled out onto the ground. He must have been passed out somewhere in the kitchen when the fire broke out. There was very little fabric left unburnt, and the flesh beneath was charred as well, with patches of black and pink, like poorly roasted meat. Raleigh was hovering with a bucket of water, and Ash took it and poured it over Haman's blistered back. The cook screamed out again and then went limp and didn't say anything more, which was a blessing. Ash sent Raleigh for more water while he struggled with himself. He wanted more than anything to disappear. He had no idea if the assassin was alive or dead. If he was alive, the Darien priest knew his identity. If he talked, Ash would never leave the city alive. He didn't know what the baker had seen either, and might talk about later. But he also knew Haman would die without treatment, and it was his fault. Raleigh had seen him too, and would ask questions if he disappeared. It wasn't like he had a real choice. Ash squatted at Haman's head and put one hand on his shoulder, where an area of skin was still whole. He grasped his amulet with the other. He hoped the lingering effects of the Darien stone wouldn't interfere with what he had to do. Healing a serious injury was less of a matter of expending power than of absorbing Haman's pain and injury into himself. He closed his eyes, concentrated, searched Haman for the pain, embraced it, stopped the flow of fluids to where they didn't belong, redirected them, found the discontinuity that heralded an injury, began to reestablish the connections. This was healing at its most basic, healing without tools, reserved to those with the gift. Time passed. He didn't move. He was vaguely aware of the commotion around him, people shouting, carrying water from the well, fighting the fire. Later, he sensed rather than saw an accumulation of people watching, but he didn't open his eyes. Haman was doing his best to cast off his ruined flesh. Ash knew if he became distracted and lost control of his patient, he wouldn't get him back. Finally, he sensed that there was no more pain and discord to gather, and Haman seemed securely resettled in his body once more. Ash shuddered, let it go, sat back on his heels, and opened his eyes. Haman's back was bright pink, the color of skin that has been too long exposed to the sun, but the blisters and charring were gone. The cook was breathing, slowly and evenly, like a man asleep. The light and heat of the fire had diminished, and Ash realized there was still a crowd of people around him. Without raising his eyes, he could see expensive boots, and the well-worn, sturdy boots of soldiers.
"Well done, healer. Miraculous, even."
The voice came from behind and above him.
"Only I wonder why you and I have never met before."
Ash turned and looked up, and found himself gazing into the cold blue eyes of the King of Arden. 20. Escape from Delphi. Again and again, over more than a month of hunting and hair-cutting, the King of Arden's words came back to Destin.
Perhaps they were looking for a place to hide, and Delphi would do nicely, don't you think?
So far, it had done well enough. The month of grace he'd allowed was over. Destin had moved his operation into the Lady of Grace full-time. His guardsmen had scoured the city, and now it was exceedingly rare to spot an uncut woman on the street. When they did find someone, she was in for a hard time. No one could claim ignorance, not anymore. Any unshorn woman was intentionally defying the order of the crown. The house-to-house search had begun. It went slowly. In some neighborhoods, there were 5 families packed into space meant for one. Tiny houses slouched together, 4 to a lot, houses where the tenants changed every night, or where people slept in shifts. The searches went on at all hours, because so many of the people of Delphi worked long hours, night and day. Nighttime raids were often the most effective, because they caught people by surprise, in their beds, and bareheaded, at least if they had heat in their houses. When they found people who needed cutting, they sheared them right then and there. They included the sick, though not with plague, invalids, old women, and the simple. They also gathered up the street people and did them too. Many of those actually did have vermin in their hair. Destin didn't care to throw anyone in jail. The prisons were already bulging, and his goal, after all, was to get everyone inspected and back to work. He made a few examples of people who had avoided inspection because they thought they were exempt. A few days in prison were enough to put fear into anyone, if they survived. Claremont's men even searched the prison itself, because there was no reason why the girl couldn't have gotten herself into trouble. It would have been ironic if he had found her there, but he didn't. Destin had moved into an upstairs room at the Lady of Grace, which gave him a needed break from Claremont and his blackbirds. Lyle Talbot Truth-Teller continued to work at the inn 1 or 2 nights a week. Destin chose to leave him alone for the time being. The boy avoided Destin when he could, without making it obvious. He seemed pale and withdrawn, nervous as a sparrow. The weather stayed miserable. The howling wind blew away anything that wasn't strapped down, and the snow drifted, in places swept almost clean away, in other places burying houses to their eaves. The town was running out of places to pile it, even when they shoved it out of the way. It never melted, but only packed down a little as new layers fell. The snow turned a gritty gray soon after falling, so new snow was only a temporary improvement. Destin cursed the girl roundly, every day, in case she was alive and vulnerable to curses. Few travelers came to Delphi, or sought approval to leave either, which was more surprising. One night Destin was sitting in the common room at the Lady. He'd just finished dinner and begun working on his second ale. It was one of those low moments when he wondered if he was destined to become a permanent resident in Delphi. He needed to find the girl, wherever she was, or make a new plan for the rest of his life, however short that might be. There were few people in the inn that night. The weather was nasty, and payday was a long way away. Lyle was taking a break from foretelling, and was eating his dinner in a corner with his back to the room to discourage any interruptions. When it was crowded, Lyle rarely ate while on duty. He never got a chance. But Will Hamlet sometimes spared the boy a bowl of stew or a meat pie when it was quiet. Claremont was hanging around, too, in case his men discovered any unshorn women out on the streets. He sulked in the corner, nursing his fourth ale. 2 of his men, Hartigan and Verden, were sharing a table in the back. They were the best of Destin's barbers. Destin was just contemplating whether he really needed a third ale when a man bulled through the front door, cursing and complaining loudly about the weather. The stranger stopped just inside with a great stomping of feet to clear them of snow. It melted into slushy gray puddles when it met the heat of the stove. He was wrapped in a huge woolen cloak, and it took him several turns to unwind himself from it and shed hat, gloves, and muffler. He was red-faced and heavy-set, one of those people who create a commotion wherever they are, just by existing. Destin glared at him sourly over his mug of ale. The stranger carried an instrument case that he set carefully aside on a bench.
"Hey, Will Hamlet," the man said cheerily. "How you be after so many years?"
Will looked up from wiping out tankards behind the bar.
"Do I know you, sir?"
he asked mildly.
"Why, I'm Hamish Fry, fiddle player and tale spinner of renown. I played an engagement for you maybe 10 years ago. I really brought in the customers, if you'll remember. I wondered if you might have need of a little entertainment here again."
He looked around the nearly empty room.
"Looks like you could use a bit of commerce."
Will shrugged.
"We've been pretty steady of late. We have a fortune teller, and he's popular."
He nodded at Lyle, who didn't turn around.
"You don't say so,"
Hamish Fry said.
"He don't look so popular right now,"
he added loudly, as if that might get a rise out of Lyle, but it didn't. So he bellied up to the bar and ordered an ale.
"I can't say Delphi's improved much,"
the tale spinner went on. He took a long drink and swiped at his mouth with the back of his hand.
"In fact, I'd say it was worse than ever. I wouldn't be up here now, but I had some trouble down south."
The man's a fool, Destin thought. He's probably on the run from the law, and here he is admitting it for all to hear. He wondered if Hamish Fry had noticed Claremont at his table in the corner. Maybe not. His cloak was buckled over his colors, in a vain attempt to keep warm.
"You know, there's one thing I'm missing that would improve things around here," Fry said with a grin. "The best thing in Delphi. Where's that daughter of yours, Will? Pretty little thing, as I remember. She used to sit and listen to my stories. Polite she was. I bet she's turning heads now."
Daughter? Will hadn't mentioned a daughter. Destin looked up to see that the innkeeper was still polishing pewter, but all the blood had drained from his face. After a long pause, Will said, "She died 4 years ago."
"Died?"
Fry reared back, surprised.
"Well, that's a bloody shame. How'd she die?"
Will darted a glance at Destin, licking his lips as if his presence made him nervous.
"There was some trouble up at the mine," he said finally. "There were several killed, and she was one."
It was odd, the way the innkeeper was reacting. If his daughter had died 4 years ago, he should be used to answering questions about her, unless she had been involved in something she shouldn't have been. Had there been some kind of rebellion or riot 4 years ago?
"What was her name, Will?"
Her name? Will had been polishing the same tankard for the entire conversation.
"Your daughter. Usually I never forget names and faces. It's a gift I have, they tell me, but I just can't. Was it J.C., Janet?"
Fry's brow furrowed, suggesting he was thinking hard. Will stared at him, shaking his head, a stricken look on his face.
"Don't tell me you forgot your own daughter's name,"
Fry said, oblivious to the reaction he was getting. By then, Destin was on his feet and moving toward the bar.
"Will,"
he said in a friendly way, "I didn't know you had a daughter." He sensed rather than saw Claremont moving too, splitting out a little so they were coming at the innkeeper from 2 different directions. Will wasn't looking at Hamish Fry anymore. His eyes were riveted on Destin.
"I don't like to talk about her. She was killed," he repeated desperately. "She's dead." "I'm sorry for your loss," Destin said. "I'd like to hear more about that. Would you mind if I ask you a few questions about her?" He nodded toward the back room. "Let's go in there. We'll talk about it over an ale." He reached out to put a hand on Will's arm, but the innkeeper backed away, keeping the bar between them, shaking his head.
"Jenna! It was Jenna!" Fry said triumphantly. "I never forget a name."
And then he stared, puzzled at the 3 men circling the bar.
"We don't want to hurt her, Will," Destin said. "We just want to find her."
"No!" Will cast about wildly, looking for any route of escape. Destin heard Claremont's sword leave its scabbard.
"No, Claremont, don't hurt him,"
Destin said quickly. "We need to talk to him." He wanted to get his hands on Will Hamlet in order to spell him. If he could subdue him, they would quickly find out what they needed to know. But Will kept his eyes on Destin. He seemed more frightened of Destin's empty hands than Claremont and his sword. He knows I'm a mage, Destin thought. He's afraid of being questioned with magic. Will threw a glance over his shoulder, then bolted for the door. Claremont stepped into his path with his sword, aiming to turn him back. Will hesitated a fraction of a second. Then, with a cry, he sprang forward, seized the surprised guardsman by the shoulders, and impaled himself on Claremont's blade, driving on until there was only inches between them. They stood face to face for a moment, innkeeper and guard, and then Will slid to the floor as Claremont, cursing, pulled his sword free. Then it was bedlam. Someone screamed. Destin and Claremont were both swearing, and Hamish Fry, the tail-spinner, was shrieking hysterically. The room quickly emptied as people fled madly through the doors. Except Lyle. The boy stood as if frozen, staring down at the body on the floor, his face a mask of horror.
"Lyle! Quick, boy, find a healer!"
Destin ordered, although he could tell by the look of things it was too late for that. But Lyle didn't go for a healer. Instead, he sank to his knees next to the body of the innkeeper, cradled Will's head in his arms, and lifted a high, keening wail, a primitive animal cry of something lost, and lost forever. A voice that seemed wrong, somehow. Then Lyle looked up at Claremont, golden eyes blazing, mad with pain and rage. He reached under the velvet jacket and came up with something shiny in his hand. A dagger. The shape of the blade struck a chord in Destin's memory. Lyle barreled into Claremont, carrying the much larger man all the way to the ground. The blade rose and fell twice. The truth-teller reared back and met Destin's gaze defiantly. He turned the blade, gripped the hilt with both hands, and buried the blade in his own chest.
"Lyle, no!"
Destin lunged at the boy, got a grip on his wrists, tightening his hold until the dagger clattered to the floor. The dragon hilt was gaudy with rubies and garnets, the blade dulled with blood. Destin realized with a sick recognition where he had seen that sort of dagger before. He knew that if he wiped off the blood, he'd find runes along the blade. He pushed Lyle down on his stomach on the floor, straddling him to keep him down. All of this was instinct. His mind was still trying to catch up, to divine why the boy was so distraught over the death of an innkeeper who had treated him with little more than indifference. Why a truth-teller would carry a dagger encrusted with jewels, the sort of blade carried by the Carthian blood-sworn guard. Was the truth-teller working for Sully, looking for the girl on his own? Did that explain his strange magic? And then it came to him. He reached for the hat first, the ridiculous velvet hat, and pulled. It was tightly secured with pins, and he had to yank at it several times before it came away in his hand, exposing a mass of hair pinned underneath. He raked his fingers roughly through it until it came free, and tumbled down, pins clattering on the floor. a thick braid that was much too long for anyone in Delphi to be wearing these days. When he shoved it aside, the neck beneath was nearly black, smudged with dirt or coal dust, artfully so. Spitting into his hand, Destin scrubbed vigorously away at the dirt on the back of the boy's neck. And, gradually, there was revealed just below the hairline a shining web of gold, centered by a faceted stone embedded in his skin. A mage mark.
"Claremont!"
he shouted hoarsely.
"It's her!"
When he got no response, he looked over to see where the captain lay on his back in a pool of blood. Hardigan, squatting next to him, shook his head.
"He's gone, sir."
That's too bad, Destin thought. I intended to kill the bastard myself.
"Get everyone out of here and lock the doors,"
he said. Gently he rolled the girl over. Her breathing was wet and labored, and she kept her golden eyes fixed on Destin's face, as if memorizing it.
"Go to the breaker, you heartless bastard," she gasped. "You're too late."
No! Destin ripped open her velvet coat and the linen shirt underneath to get at the wound. The blade had entered just beneath her ribcage. Blood welled from the wound, trickling onto the stones beneath her. He put his ear to her chest, listening for the wet sound that would tell him she had hit a lung. Her breathing was clear, but the flesh around the gash was oddly cold, something only a mage like himself could have detected. Icy fear channeled through him. The girl was damaged, despite all his efforts to prevent it. Worse, if what he'd heard about this blood-sworn blade was true, she was as good as dead already. The question was, should he let her die, or move heaven and earth to save her? There were things he needed to know before she died. He gripped the lapels of her coat, lifting her a few inches off the floor.
"What does it mean, that mage mark on the back of your neck? What does it signify?"
"You tell me," she whispered. "Damned if I know."
Her eyelids fluttered, and she slipped into unconsciousness.
"Who are you?"
he growled, wanting to shake her.
"Why is Celestine hunting you? What does she want with you?"
That answer, if he had it, would have helped him decide. But he didn't have it. Since he couldn't raise the dead, and he had to answer to the king, he'd have to save her if he could. Though he was a mage, Destin knew nothing about healing. He'd never been encouraged to develop that skill, and he wouldn't trust anyone in Delphi enough to put her into their hands. He had to get her to Arden's-Court. If anyone could help her, it would be the healers there. He looked up at Verdun and Hardigan, who were standing by for orders.
"I'll need a carriage and a team on the double, and supplies for a week on the road. Also, a dozen men ready to travel."
He said this, even though he suspected that if it took a week to get to Arden's-Court, he'd be delivering a corpse. 21. Ash meets the king. Ash slumped forward into a bough that put his forehead on the ground. After a moment, he heard Montaigne say something, and then the blackbirds seized his arms and lifted him to his feet, turning him to face the king. He could not have stood unassisted. He was weak and disoriented, nearly overcome by the pain and disorder he'd assumed from the baker. His eyes still burned, and his vision swam from the effects of the Darien stone. Ash had been filthy before he entered the palace. Now he was acutely aware of his torn and bloody breeches, his hair plastered down with well water, the acrid stink of kerosene. He tried to wipe at his face with his sleeve, but the guardsmen had tight hold of his arms. The king stood amid a small group of noblemen, dressed as if they had come directly from dinner. They hadn't done any firefighting, since their clothing was pristine. One was a thick-set man in an Ardenine army uniform, his hair and eyes the color of razor-leaf spit. The braid on his shoulders said he was a high-up. Marin Karn, Ash guessed, commander of the Ardenine army. But that wasn't the biggest surprise. That happened when his vision cleared enough that he could look past the king and see Lila Barrowhill, standing behind and a little to the right of Montaigne. Their eyes met, and for a split second, hers widened in shock and alarm. Then she cleared that away, replacing it with a faint, puzzled frown. The appropriate response to a charred scarecrow like Ash. One you'd never seen before in your life. Bloody bones, Ash thought. What is she doing here, being all chummy with the King of Arden? He hastily shifted his gaze to the ground, trying to clear his own face of any telltale expression.
"Who are you?"
the king asked.
"Adam Freeman,"
Ash replied softly, keeping his eyes fixed on the stones of the courtyard as thoughts bullied their way into his head. If he weren't so thoroughly wrung out, he could kill the bastard on the spot. In his present condition, he'd be lucky to strangle a gnat. He had no weapons. He'd lost his healing kit somewhere in the cellars, and he'd thrown his only shiv at the blood-sucking priest. He made a mental note. Always carry spare weapons.
"Where did you come from?"
the king asked.
"I work in the stables, Your Majesty."
He hoped the king wouldn't recognize him and recall his display the day Crusher went down. He guessed in his present state he'd be hard to pick out.
"We have a healer working in the stables?"
The king's tone was incredulous.
"Are you a healer of horses?"
The rest of the Bluebloods chuckled and nudged each other. Ash shook his head, which was a mistake, since it set his head to spinning again.
"When I came here, I applied to work in the healing halls, but they said they didn't need anyone, so Marshal Bellamy took me on."
He stole a glance toward the kitchen. It appeared that the fire was entirely out.
"We always have a need for healers, Freeman," Montaigne said. "Especially those who perform miraculous cures. Where did you receive your training?"
Ash looked up, finally able to meet the king's eye and speak without snarling.
"My mother was a healer, my lord. She taught me something of it. My father didn't approve, so I am also very good at mucking out stalls."
The nobles chuckled again.
"I see."
The king stared at him thoughtfully, stroking his chin.
"It appears you have a gift. In fact, I've never seen anything to match it."
He was talking around the issue of sorcery, but it lay there between them, nonetheless.
"I would recommend caution, Your Grace."
This was a new voice, and Ash looked up to see that it was one of the king's companions, a tall, spare man in dark religious garb. A great rising sun of Malthus was emblazoned on his tabard, and he wore the keys to the kingdom on a heavy gold chain around his waist. Bloody bones, Ash thought. It's the Principia himself, the spiritual head of the Church of Malthus. Ash racked his brain, trying to recall the man's name. Ah, that's it. Cedric Fosnot. Do they all drink the blood of mages? Ash wondered. Or is it just the Darien Guild? He sent up a prayer for the latter.
"This healing could be miraculous," Fosnot continued. "A manifestation of the Redeemer's mysterious mercy. But the man may not be a true healer."
He looked around the circle of Bluebloods, his expression grave, making sure he had his audience.
"It is possible he is a sorcerer."
So either Malthus did it, or I'm dead, Ash thought. But he said nothing. He knew he was on very treacherous ground. Malthus could have the credit as far as he was concerned. Receiving no response from Ash, the Principia gestured toward Haman.
"This healing could be no more than an illusion. The flesh could be corrupt beneath the skin."
He produced a thin blade from within the folds of his robe.
"Perhaps we should open him up and see."
At this, Ash tried to lunge forward, but found himself still restrained by the guards.
"Don't lay a hand on him,"
he said, forgetting himself in his outrage.
"He's been through enough tonight. Leave him alone." "Perhaps the mage fears exposure,"
the priest said calmly.
"Your Grace, for safety's sake, I recommend that,
he be delivered to my office for examination by the Hand.
The Hand of Malthus was the team of inquisitors maintained by the Principia of the Church, all priests and all adept at the art of torture, or so Ash had heard. It was said the Hand could force a confession out of any man, guilty or not. Or, to say it another way, they had never yet interrogated an innocent man. Montaigne often used the red-clad priests of the Hand to punish his enemies when it suited him politically. At least that was what was said in the Fells. This church is bound to have my blood, one way or another, Ash thought. The king shook his head.
Father Fosnot, I disagree.
The note of warning in his voice was unmistakable.
This boy is no sorcerer. I can always sense the taint when it is present.
The Principia bowed, his face tight and unhappy. Likely he knew better than to contradict the king. In one of those ironic twists of fate, the King of Arden had intervened to save the life of someone he'd marked for death. Odd that nobody suggested that they search him for an amulet. That would have been the most undeniable proof. It was as if they all knew how to play this hypocritical game. Montaigne turned to his cadre of guards.
Take this boy to the guest quarters. See that he has a bath and a change of clothes. I'll want to see him in the morning.
That was said loudly for the benefit of everyone, and then Montaigne turned and spoke softly to Karn. Suspicion flared in Ash's muddy mind. What did that mean, the guest quarters? Was it code for the dungeon? Had he been recognized after all? The two guards who had hold of him made as if to escort him away, but Ash dug in his heels.
Am I to be taken prisoner for helping a man, Your Majesty? He demanded. Is the practice of the healing arts illegal in Arden's court?
The king looked up, surprised.
No, my boy,
he said softly, making it clear his patience was being sorely tried.
Here in Arden's court, we reward those with talent by washing the filth off them and finding them something useful to do.
He nodded to the two guards.
Proceed.
He turned with a swirl of his velvet cloak and strode across the courtyard, his courtiers following, like a comet with a long tail. Two blackbirds began sliding the baker onto a litter in order to carry him inside. The guards had their hands on Ash's arms, and he could feel the tingle of magic in them, and he knew there was nothing to do but submit. They led him in through the servants' entrance he himself had breached earlier in the evening, slowing their steps to match his stumbling gait, half supporting him when he faltered. They walked back through the palace, past the staircase where he'd met the Darien brother, and kept going. Given how the day had gone so far, Ash half expected the Darien brother to appear at any moment, condemning him by calling out his name. But he saw only the usual servants and scribes, who quickly moved out of the way, staring after them after they had passed. No doubt he looked like a prisoner, towering over his two guards. They were probably wondering what he was guilty of. Finally, they entered a quiet part of the palace, tastefully appointed, lined with sumptuous suites and apartments. At least this didn't seem to be the way to the dungeon. Windows along the hallway looked out to formal gardens, still blooming with cool weather flowers. They passed libraries and game rooms, all empty of people. At the far end were more modest quarters, maybe meant for ladies and attendants of residents of the guest suites, rows of plain wooden doors, all the same. Ash's escorts stopped in front of one of them, pushed the door open, and stood aside so he could enter. It was a small, plain room with a stone floor and brightly woven Weanhaven rugs scattered here and there. There was a fireplace at one end with a small sitting area, and a bed at the other with a trunk at its foot. There was no window, no way out that he could see. His two guards stepped outside and closed the door. Ash stood awkwardly in the center of the room, faint with fatigue, unable to put two thoughts together. There was a looking-glass on the wall above a pedestal sink. His image in the glass was frightening. His face was reddened, as if sunburned, and his eyes a flaming red from the effects of the Darien stone. He supposed he looked like a demon, though the king must have assumed that it was the result of the smoke and the flames. Ash lowered himself onto the raised stone hearth and nervously shoved his fingers through his filthy hair. A brisk knock at the door aroused him. 2 chambermaids pushed it open without waiting for a response, dragged in a large metal tub, placed it close to the hearth, then left again. They returned moments later with a trolley loaded with buckets of steaming water. These were big, muscular, sturdy girls who lifted the buckets of water easily and poured them into the tub. Then one of them laid a fire in the fireplace, which she lit with a coal from a tin box. While Ash watched from his seat on the hearth, the servants came and went twice more, bringing more water and soap and scrub brushes and towels. Then they stood on either side of the tub, as if awaiting further orders. The hot water in the tub looked wonderful. Ash decided that if he were going to be arrested or knifed to death, it might as well be after a bath. He creaked to his feet, his body remembering every bad thing that had happened to it. "Thank you," he said. "Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to take my bath now." They moved forward in tandem, like well-matched carriage horses. One of them began untying the cord at the neck of his tunic, and the other fumbled with his trousers.
Stop that!
Ash stepped back hastily, nearly stumbling over the edge of the hearth, clutching the top of his breeches, which were in danger of falling down.
"I can manage on my own," he said firmly. "Although I may not look like it now, I've taken a bath before."
Though Ash had been brought up in a palace, staff at Fellsmarch had more important things to do than bathe him once he'd left the nursery. That prepared him for his years at Odin's Ford, where students were expected to clean their own rooms, change their own linens, and walk across the commons to the bathhouse. Though it came as quite a shock to some, the school was known as the Great Equalizer, humbling the proud and raising up the less fortunate. After some protest, and with many backward looks, the servants left. Ash waited a minute or two to make sure they were gone, then stripped off his filthy clothes and dropped them on the floor. Wearing only his amulet, he eased into the hot water gratefully, despite the stinging of the wound on his leg and all his bumps and bruises from the cellar. He sank down to his chin and soaked. Despite his best intentions, he promptly fell asleep. When he awoke, he noticed to his chagrin that someone had been in and taken his clothes away. New clothes were laid across a chair. He decided he'd better finish up before anyone else intruded. First he washed his face again and rinsed his eyes before he got soap in the water. Then, using the soap and scrub brushes, he scrubbed himself from head to toe, cleaning out the wound on his leg as well as he could. It looked